Have you ever wondered what it feels like to walk through a jungle where every leaf, every stick, every oddly silent patch of earth might be hiding death beneath it? What if a piece of grass wasn't just grass, but the final detail in a trap designed to end a soldier's life? In the Vietnam War, such questions weren't poetic, they were practical and terrifying. Maybe you're lying in bed right now, your phone dimmed, the room quiet, the world outside asleep. Maybe you're listening from the US or New York, or in a little village where the only sound is the slow hum of a ceiling fan. Wherever you are, just take a breath, let your body settle, and close your eyes if you like. Let us take you back, slowly, carefully, into a forest where the trees were not alone, and the silence itself had teeth. And while we drift through the foliage of time, remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because you never know which part of history might help you sleep or haunt your thoughts long after the story ends. Tonight's tale is not about battles with rifles or bombs, not about generals or famous strategies. It's about quiet killer's traps, hidden, patient, and unforgiving. It's about the Viet Cong's uncanny ability to turn the natural world into a deadly maze. From punji stake pits and tripwires to poisoned spikes and buried snakes, these traps weren't just weapons. They were whispers of psychological warfare, lying in wait beneath leaves and mud. To understand them, you have to imagine a place of stillness, where every step could be your last, but nothing ever announces itself. No marching drums, no gunfire. Just a sudden click, a snap, or a scream, and then silence again. The Vietnam War wasn't just fought above ground, and it wasn't just fought with guns. Beneath the earth, under villages and fields, ran an entire underworld. The Siu Chi tunnels. Picture this: hundreds of kilometers of narrow, airless, booby-trapped tunnels dug by hand, weaving like roots under the forest floor. Here, guerrilla fighters lived, cooked, planned attacks, and even gave medical treatment, while just meters above them, American and South Vietnamese troops passed unaware. The tunnels were suffocating, dark, hot, and cramped. Rats scurried, water dripped from makeshift ceilings, and oxygen was precious. Yet in this underground world, war was planned with precision. The jungle, meanwhile, became a breathing trap. Bamboo was everywhere, and the Viet Cong turned this simple plant into a brutal weapon. Punji sticks-long, sharpened bamboo stakes were hidden in pits covered with foliage. Some were coated in animal feces or poison, designed not just to pierce, but to infect. A single misstep, and a soldier might find his leg skewered, his screen swallowed by the trees, his mind permanently marked by pain and fear. It wasn't just the injury, it was the humiliation of falling for something so low-tech, so primal, and yet so effective. One American Marine once stepped on what looked like a rock. It tilted, releasing a wire. A spring-loaded bamboo whip lashed out from the trees, driving barbed hooks into his shoulder. He survived, but in his own words, the jungle started whispering to me after that. I stopped trusting the ground. And that was the point. These traps were not designed to kill swiftly. They were designed to maim, to slow, to make others turn their heads in fear. In many cases, when one soldier fell, others followed into the same pit. Traps were often layered, one for the first man, another for the one trying to rescue him. In a chilling variation, a small fake clearing would contain a single punji trap, and nearby, just hidden from view, a larger pit would await the rescuers. One sergeant described it as a forest that didn't want us there and showed it with teeth. But the ground wasn't the only enemy. The Viet Cong also used water. Wells and streams were poisoned with substances that made soldiers violently ill. Sometimes, caches of rice or supplies were left behind, contaminated with toxins, as a cruel offering to desperate patrols. Insects and animals, too, were part of the arsenal. Poisonous snakes were placed in hollow logs or even in sleeping bags. Scorpions and centipedes were tied inside bamboo cages and left along trails. One American soldier recalled unzipping his rucksack and being bitten on the wrist by a crate snake. The venom numbed his arm in minutes. He lived, but never opened a bag the same way again. And then there were the tunnels. To American forces, the discovery of the Siu-Chi tunnels was like stumbling upon a dark mirror world. Once they realized how vast the network was, they sent tunnel rats small, agile soldiers who volunteered to crawl into the tight passages with only a flashlight and a pistol. Some of them never came out. One such man, Sergeant Orozco, remembered crawling forward in complete darkness, his face inches from the walls, when he felt a faint breeze. It meant a trapdoor had opened somewhere ahead. He froze. In that moment, every sound became too loud. His breath, his heartbeat, the rustling of unseen things. In that silence, he waited, sweating, unsure if he would be met with a bullet, a blade, or just the echo of footsteps retreating deeper into the maze. These stories aren't dramatized. They are fragments of memory, buried in old journals, in whispered recollections, in the silence of veterans who still dream of shadows in the leaves. The traps left more than scars. They left doubt. Soldiers began to mistrust the jungle, their boots, their instincts. A snapped twig could mean nothing or everything. Even after the war, the legacy continued. Fields in Cambodia and Vietnam still carry unexploded devices. Farmers till the soil in fear. Children walk to school with careful steps. In some cases, organizations continue to search for and remove old punji pits. One man, a former Khmer Rouge, child soldier named Aki Ra, made it his life mission to disarm leftover landmines, trap by trap. He now runs a museum to warn future generations. But why did the Viet Cong rely so heavily on these cruel handmade traps? Why not just fight with guns? The answer lies in a different kind of warfare psychological. The Viet Cong were often outnumbered and outgunned. They couldn't match American firepower, but they could exploit fear. They could make a platoon of trained soldiers move like frightened deer, glancing at every leaf as if it had fangs. The jungle became the enemy. The ground became suspect. Time itself seemed to slow as the soldiers waited for the snap, the scream, and the silence that followed. As one veteran said, "We weren't just fighting people. We were fighting a place." And the place was winning. Perhaps now, as your breathing deepens and your eyes grow heavier, you can feel it, that quiet tension, the stillness of a world wrapped in leaves and whispers. But the real story hasn't even begun. We've only wandered into the edge of the trees. In the next part, we go deeper into the tunnels, into the minds of those who built them, and into the darker corners of a war that never fought fair. Let's listen to what comes next. Something is haunting about the idea that the ground itself might be hiding you from the world above. That beneath your feet lies not just rock and root, but entire rooms, narrow passageways, chambers where people cooked, planned, healed, and waited without ever being seen. This was the reality of the Siu-Chi tunnels, a shadow world carved by human hands under the jungles of Vietnam. While the war raged on above, while helicopters beat the air and artillery shook the trees, entire communities moved like ghosts in the dark beneath the soil. The tunnels weren't wide. They weren't meant for comfort. Most were just shoulder width, barely tall enough to crawl through. The air was thick, stale, and often toxic from cooking smoke and sweat. And yet, for the Viet Cong, this was home. Here they ate, slept, hid their wounded, prepared attacks, and disappeared again, swallowed by the earth before the enemy could react. The entrances to these tunnels were everywhere, and nowhere some, hidden under termite mounds, others tucked beneath riverbanks or beneath floorboards of civilian huts. Some were so well disguised that American patrols would walk over them, unaware that a fighter had just slipped through the trapdoor behind them. These tunnels weren't just dug lines, they were complex systems with ventilation shafts, hidden escape routes, and deadly surprises for any uninvited guest. Booby traps were laced into the passageways, triggered by tripwires or pressure plates. Even if you found the tunnel, even if you dared to enter, you might not come back. One tunnel rat described it as crawling into the belly of a snake that was also dreaming of revenge. He said the air was so still it felt alive, like something waiting to breathe you in and never breathe you back out. The psychological toll of these tunnels was enormous. For the Americans, it was a war where the enemy could disappear into the earth itself, only to emerge hours or days later from a different location to strike again. They tried bombing the ground, burning the forests, even flooding the tunnels, but the Viet Cong adapted. They used U-shaped bends in the tunnel layouts to stop water and gas from reaching deep areas. They used bamboo to build air shafts that looked like simple sticks on the surface. They even built trap chambers inside the tunnels, false walls that opened to ambush points, pits with punji sticks at the bottom, or runes designed to collapse and bury invaders alive. Inside these tunnels, time moved differently. It wasn't measured by sunlight or clocks, but by the sound of movement, the rhythm of breathing, the muffled whispers of comrades planning a sabotage run or tending a wound. Imagine lying on a clay bed 6 feet under the jungle, listening to distant explosions and knowing that above you, someone is searching for you with a flamethrower. Yet you can't make a sound. You can't cough. You can't panic. You just listen and wait. Some tunnels had kitchens that vented smoke through long underground paths, releasing it far from the actual chamber to avoid detection. Meals were cooked early in the morning when the jungle was still misty, so the smoke would blend in and rise unnoticed. Water was collected from underground wells or carried in secret. Wounded soldiers were treated by dim candlelight, often without proper medicine, often with only cloth, bamboo splints, and a soft prayer to keep them alive. And yet they did survive somehow. The Siuchi tunnels weren't just engineering marvels. They were statements of defiance. They said, "We will not fight you in the open, but we will outweight you, outmaneuver you, and unsettle your soul." The U.S. response to these tunnels grew more desperate over time. Special units were formed, known as tunnel rats volunteers, who had to be small enough to fit through the passages and brave enough to crawl into darkness, armed only with a flashlight and a sidearm. Their work was among the most dangerous in the war. They faced not only enemy fighters, but also snakes, bats, scorpions, booby traps, and the weight of the earth itself pressing in. One tunnel rat recounted crawling through a tunnel when he suddenly felt something soft brush his arm. He froze, heart pounding, and shone his light to find a massive cobra coiled on a ledge. It didn't strike, neither did he. He backed out, inch by inch, whispering apologies to the dark. For these soldiers, the tunnels became a nightmare maze alive with danger, always shifting, always watching. But the tunnels were just one side of the story. On the surface, the Viet Cong were creating a living map of fear. They learned the movements of enemy patrols, planted traps along trails, inside huts, and even in rice paddies. Some traps were mechanical, bamboo whips triggered by tripwires, metal spikes launched from hidden holes. Others were psychological, dummies made to look like corpses that exploded when touched, or children's toys rigged with explosives left where soldiers might bend to pick them up. There was a cruel intelligence behind all of it, and knowledge that fear was a more powerful weapon than fire. In many ways, the Viet Cong waged war like nature itself, quiet patient, always adapting. They understood that American forces would grow tired, demoralized, and confused by an enemy they rarely saw. They didn't need to win in a conventional sense. They only needed the invaders to leave. In one infamous region known as the Iron Triangle, nearly every trail and clearing was trapped. Soldiers had to walk in single file, staring at the heels of the front man, terrified that one step might end everything. Engineers called in to clear the area sometimes refused to continue. After seeing a buddy fall into a pit or catch a whip to the chest, one area was so densely trapped that it was nicknamed the Garden of Bone. In another village, a patrol discovered a hut with a floor made of thatched bamboo. When they entered, one man stepped on a weak plank and fell into a pit below punji. Stakes tore into his legs. When his comrades rushed to help, another section of the floor collapsed under them. The trap wasn't meant to kill them all at once. It was designed to wait, to punish kindness, to punish rescue. That's the cruelty of these devices. They turned human instinct against itself. The traps also evolved. Early versions were simple, even crude. But as the war dragged on, the Viet Cong refined their techniques. Some punji pits had hinges, so that when weight was applied, the stakes would snap upward with force. Others were built in pairs, one wound, the other kill. Mines were disguised as leaves or packed into soda cans. One soldier described reaching for a bottle of water and triggering a grenade hidden beneath the sand. Another remembers setting his pack down beside a log just before it exploded. These weren't high-tech explosives. These were things you'd find in a village market, turned into death by hands that understood patience. By the end of the 1960s, American forces were spending more time scanning the ground than watching the horizon. They moved more slowly, trusted less, slept in shifts, and whispered more. They developed thick-soled boots, body armor, long metal, prodding sticks, but none of it erased the feeling that the very earth hated them. That no matter what they did, the jungle would strike again. Now, as you rest, you may feel that quiet weight, the slow realization that war doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it waits underground. But we're not done yet. In the next part, we'll look closer at the cruel creativity of the traps themselves, their designs, their purpose, the twisted psychology behind each hidden spike. Because in the war that never slept, even the simplest piece of wood could change everything. Let's continue deeper. Imagine walking down a narrow jungle path with sunlight barely piercing the green canopy above, and every rustle in the underbrush makes your skin crawl. Not because you fear an animal or a bullet, but because your foot might land on something that doesn't belong. It might be a trap disguised as fallen leaves, or a tripwire thinner than a vine, or a pressure plate made of bamboo just waiting for weight. This was the environment soldiers lived in daily. They didn't fear open battles as much as they feared what they couldn't see, because by the time you saw it, it was too late. The Viet Cong, with limited resources and almost no access to high-end military equipment, created a world of traps that were brutal in their simplicity and terrifying in their effectiveness. It wasn't about how advanced the weapon was. It was about how smartly it was hidden, how it manipulated instinct, how it made soldiers distrust even the ground they walked on. Let's talk about the punji stake traps, those sharpened bamboo spikes that pierce through flesh like spears disguised in pits. The basic version involved a pit, perhaps 5 feet deep, filled with upward-facing punji sticks and camouflaged with light foliage and a thin layer of earth. The spikes weren't just designed to pierce the skin. They were coated in toxins, feces, or decaying organic material, increasing the risk of infection, gangrene, and psychological distress. Soldiers feared these wounds more than gunshots. A bullet might be fast and clean. A punji stake wound lingered. It swelled, it oozed, it stank. Sometimes, medics had to amputate limbs just to prevent the infection from spreading. Even if a soldier survived the trap, he was often out of action, permanently, and the memory of what happened stayed far longer than the pain itself. But the Viet Cong didn't stop at basic pits. They began creating variations, tilting board traps where the floor would swing open under weight, dropping the soldier onto spikes below. Spiked foot traps made to clamp over a boot and shred through. Flesh like teeth. And horizontal stake traps, designed not to hit the foot, but the side of the body, the chest, the face. There were even rotating stake traps, where soldiers would fall onto spinning wheels of sharpened bamboo. Imagine the psychological toll of knowing that a tree stump might explode, or that a water jug sitting peacefully on a trail might be the last thing you ever touch. The grenade in a can trap became infamous. A simple device, a hand grenade with its pin pulled, placed inside a can, held taut with a string or rubber band. Step on it, move the can, or even brush the string in it. Detonated. It took only a few minutes to construct and could kill or maim anyone unlucky enough to disturb it. These were often hidden where troops naturally walked or where supplies might be stored. Soldiers began to fear their routines. They stopped stepping over logs. They avoided bending down. Even picking up a lost helmet became an act of bravery. And then came the bamboo whip traps, simple yet savage. A flexible bamboo stalk would be bent and anchored with tension. A sharp object, often barbed or poisoned, would be tied to the tip. When a soldier tripped a wire, the stalk would release with violent force, striking the victim at high speed. These weren't designed to kill immediately. They were built to tear flesh, blind, or leave deep lacerations. They were built to cause screams that echoed through the trees and rattled the morale of the entire squad. Other traps were designed to drop heavy weights onto unsuspecting soldiers. In one variation, large stones were suspended by thin vines or sticks above a trail. When the support was tripped, the stones would crash down like a primitive hammer, crushing limbs or skulls. Falling traps became increasingly sophisticated. Some were triggered by tripwires, placed low to the ground, others by disguised footplates. There were even side-swinging log traps, logs laced with nails, glass, or metal, rigged to swing from trees and strike anyone who triggered their line. These weren't just physical weapons, they were emotional ones. The fear they generated didn't fade with the wound. It stuck in the mind. The constant awareness that death was hiding in silence, in stillness, in the ordinary. Over time, these fears began to spread through units. Soldiers developed superstitions. Some would avoid trails altogether and crash through dense brush instead. Others refused to touch anything that wasn't cleared by someone else. They tied a string to their boots to detect wires, used mirrors to reflect the path ahead, and even carried sticks to tap the ground like blind men searching for a safe route through the jungle of the dead. One soldier wrote in his diary, "I no longer see leaves, I see knives." That level of psychological exhaustion had a powerful effect on morale. The enemy became invisible. The jungle itself became the enemy. And then there were the net traps, deceptively innocent until they weren't. Large camouflaged nets would be laid on the ground, covering trapdoors or concealing pits. When a soldier stepped on the net, a mechanism would lift or tighten the web, pulling the victim upward and leaving them suspended, helpless, often surrounded by other traps, waiting to punish the rescue attempt. These net traps weren't necessarily meant to kill, they were meant to slow, to delay, to terrify. Because the moment a soldier was caught, time stretched. He was no longer in control. And in that suspended fear, others around him became vulnerable. Some units set traps that required the rescuers to risk stepping into a second trap or triggering a delayed grenade designed specifically to strike the second wave. This layered cruelty made even acts of compassion dangerous. But what may be the most psychologically disturbing trap was the poisoned bait trap. The Viet Cong would sometimes leave behind items that looked like useful equipment canteens, ration, packs, extra ammunition. These items were sometimes laced with toxins or rigged with explosives. A soldier might find what seemed like a gift, only to realize too late that it was a trap designed to punish desperation. Imagine being low on food, finding rice in a clearing, and hours later, your stomach cramps, you sweat, you vomit, and no medic can save you. Even when no physical trap was present, the fear that anything might be a trap made soldiers hesitate, second-guess, freeze when action was needed most. This uncertainty was a form of warfare in itself. And let's not forget the poisonous creature traps, snakes, scorpions, centipedes, even spiders were weaponized. Trapped in baskets or buried in pits, these creatures were released by triggering hidden mechanisms. One chilling tactic involved stuffing venomous snakes into hollow bamboo tubes placed in supply caches. Another involved planting them in soldiers' gear at night. In one documented case, a soldier awoke to find a snake coiled inside his boot. His scream alerted the entire camp, but the bite had already been delivered. That soldier survived, but he never put on his boots the same way again. Fear doesn't sleep, and neither did these traps. They were always active, always waiting. And even when a day passed without injury, the question remained, what did we miss? What's still out there, buried under leaves, dreaming in the dark? As you breathe slower, deeper, as your mind drifts gently toward sleep, keep in mind, we've only explored the surface of these devices. In the next part, we'll descend deeper into how these traps were used not just to hurt, but to bend entire strategies, to control the terrain, to make commanders rethink their movements. Because in the jungles of Vietnam, the real battle wasn't always against men. Sometimes it was against the invisible hand of fear itself. Let's keep going. It's easy to imagine war in terms of large battles and loud moments, planes overhead, gunfire in the distance, and soldiers running across open fields. But in the Vietnam War, many of the most decisive moments were quiet. They didn't unfold in open spaces, but under thick jungle canopies, beneath fog-covered rice paddies, and inside mines that were slowly unraveling from exhaustion and fear. What made the Viet Cong's trap strategy so effective wasn't just their design. It was the way they changed how soldiers moved, how they thought, how they breathed. The jungle didn't have to fight you if it could make you fight yourself. Over time, the traps began to influence not just individual patrols, but entire military strategies. Commanders found themselves unable to rely on traditional movement tactics. Maps lost their meaning when the terrain was littered with invisible dangers. Supply lines became harder to establish. Communication between units was delayed because speed was no longer possible. Soldiers could no longer walk 2 or 3 across, shoulder to shoulder. They had to move in single file, eyes locked on the heels ahead of them, trusting that the front man hadn't missed a tripwire or a camouflaged pit. And if the first man was hit, the second had to make a choice: help and risk a second trap, or freeze and wait for clearance if it ever came. This slow, tense movement not only drained physical energy, but also emotional stamina. The simplest decision, turning left instead of right, felt loaded with danger. The Viet Cong understood this. They weren't trying to kill thousands with every trap. They were trying to kill certainty. If soldiers weren't sure where to walk, or where to rest, or whether their next step might be their last, they were easier to defeat, not on the battlefield, but in their minds. Some units reported taking hours to move just a few hundred meters, not because of enemy fire, but because they had to check every step, prod every bush, avoid every sound that wasn't familiar. This grinding pace exhausted them. And when exhaustion sets in, mistakes follow. Some soldiers fell into traps, not because the traps were brilliant, but because they simply stopped looking. They were too tired to care. In this way, the traps became tools of endurance warfare. The longer the enemy had to remain alert, the greater the chance they would slip. And the Viet Cong were always watching for that moment. They placed traps in places that forced a choice. At a river crossing, one side might be heavily trapped. The other side might look safe, but was it? Soldiers had to decide whether to follow the obvious path or risk the overgrown one. Sometimes both were trapped, sometimes neither. But the doubt was the real weapon. And when the same choice had to be made day after day, week after week, the mind began to fracture. Some traps were deliberately placed near items of value: ammunition crates, supply drops, radios, even bodies. One tactic involved killing a soldier and placing a grenade under his body, with the pin secured only by his weight. When his comrades tried to rescue him, they triggered the trap. The cruelty wasn't in the explosion. It was in the betrayal of loyalty, the weaponization of grief. Other traps involved timing. The Viet Cong would sometimes watch a patrol pass safely through an area, only to place traps there overnight, knowing that the same patrol would return the next day, thinking the path was clear. This level of psychological manipulation made soldiers question their memories. Wasn't this safe yesterday? Did I step here before? The answer didn't matter. What mattered was the new hesitation in their step. The Americans developed techniques to counter these traps: minesweepers, trained dogs, and long metal prods called punji sticks used to poke the ground ahead. But none of these were perfect. Dogs were sometimes scared off by gunfire. Sweepers missed homemade devices made from wood and bamboo, and punji sticks couldn't be used in every terrain. The jungle was too dense, too varied. It adapted, and so did the traps. Eventually, the Americans deployed heavy machinery, bulldozers, flamethrowers, chemicals like Agent Orange to strip the foliage and remove hiding places. But even that didn't work completely. The tunnels ran deeper. The traps were replaced, and the moral cost of these scorched earth tactics was high. Villages were destroyed. Civilians suffered. The land itself groaned under the weight of war. One soldier wrote in a letter home. "It's not that we're losing. It's that we're not sure what we're fighting anymore. The jungle seems to know us better than we know ourselves." In some areas, the fear of traps was so intense that units refused to move until engineers cleared the way. But engineers couldn't be everywhere. Some units had to return to old habits, moving slowly, quietly, watching for signs. A broken twig, a stone that didn't belong, a trail that seemed too clean. One platoon leader reported that his men began hallucinating trap-seeing wires where there were none, imagining pits beneath every bush. It wasn't madness. It was hypervigilance stretched too far. And still, the traps evolved. The Viet Cong began experimenting with traps that were designed to inflict very specific types of wounds. Leg injuries were common because a disabled soldier slowed the unit down. But they also began building traps that targeted arms, making it impossible to carry a rifle. Some traps struck the face, shattering morale as well as bone. The idea was not just to wound, but to mark, to send soldiers back to their units, disfigured, limping, shaken. These visible wounds carried stories with them, stories of terror, stories that spread faster than bullets. A trap didn't just strike once, it struck again and again in the minds of those who heard about it. And while American forces recorded injuries and casualties, they couldn't measure the weight of fear. There were no charts for how long it took a man to fall asleep after patrol, or how often he woke in the night thinking he heard a click. The emotional toll of trap warfare was enormous. It didn't just target soldiers. It infected command, communication, and even planning. Entire missions were delayed due to the fear of terrain. A general might cancel an operation if reports suggested heavy booby trapping. Terrain became a strategic factor in ways it hadn't been before. You couldn't just conquer a location, you had to trust it. And increasingly, no one trusted anything. Even victory became complicated. If a hill was captured, but 3 men were lost to traps, was it worth it? Was it worth it? If a village was secured, but 2 soldiers were blinded by bamboo spikes, could it be held? The jungle gave no answers. Only more silence and more waiting. As the war dragged on, the lines between friend and foe blurred. Traps appeared in places thought to be safe. Allies were accused of betrayal. Civilians were suspected of planting devices. The traps did more than harm, they divided. They spread suspicion. In a conflict already steeped in confusion, the traps added another layer of fog. Now, as you lie still, letting the rhythm of this story drift through your thoughts, perhaps you can understand why these devices were feared so deeply. Not because they exploded loudly, but because they whispered slowly. They changed how soldiers walked, how they talked, how they trusted, how they hoped. And yet, there's more to understand. In the next part, we'll explore the ways the Viet Cong used nature itself poisoned food, deadly insects, and hidden sabotage to deepen the war's silent cruelty. Because sometimes, the most dangerous weapons aren't made of steel. They crawl, they bite, they wait, and they change the very act of survival. Let's continue ... If you've ever woken up in the middle of the night with something crawling across your skin, you know the sensation: brief panic, sudden stillness, a sharp inhale of breath, even if it turns out to be nothing more than a loose thread or a speck of dust. But now imagine that sensation wasn't imagined. Imagine you were a soldier in a strange jungle, lying in your hammock or foxhole after hours of patrol, your body already sore, your eyes too tired to stay open. When you feel something reel a cold sliver along your chest, a tiny prick along your neck, and then burning pain. By the time your heart understands what's happening, venom is already flowing through your blood. This was no accident in the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong didn't just use bombs and blades. They used what the jungle offered: insects, snakes, scorpions, frogs, poisonous plants, toxic water, and spoiled food. It was warfare at its most primal, letting nature itself become a weapon. These weren't tools of mass destruction. They were tools of psychological erosion. One soldier once wrote, "I wasn't afraid of dying in a firefight. I was afraid of reaching into my pack and finding something alive inside it." That fear wasn't exaggerated. Viet Cong fighters learned to weaponize living creatures with terrifying efficiency. In some cases, they placed venomous snakes, such as the deadly kite or pit viper, inside hollow bamboo tubes, in supply crates, or even tied to trees with just enough rope to strike at passing boots. These snakes weren't just placed randomly. They were trained, in a sense, by being kept in dark, confined spaces, so they would strike immediately upon release. Soldiers often never saw the snake, only felt the sting, and then the world slipping sideways. There were also scorpion baskets, small woven traps hidden along footpaths or under leaves, filled with angry black forest scorpions that were poked or starved to increase their aggression. Triggering a tripwire would pull open the lid of the basket, releasing the scorpions across the path or directly onto the soldier. Imagine brushing aside a leaf and finding your legs suddenly crawling with creatures that sting like fire. Medical treatment was available, but rarely immediate, and often ineffective deep in the jungle. These attacks didn't always kill, but they slowed, terrified, and traumatized. Insects were used in even more subtle ways. Viet Cong soldiers harvested ants, particularly red-biting ants, and placed entire colonies inside small clay pots, sealed with banana leaves. These were buried near footpaths or booby-trapped doorways. When the trap triggered, the pot would shatter, sending thousands of angry ants over the intruder. Unlike traditional traps, there was no explosion, no visible enemy, just a maddening swarm of bites and chaos. This was a different kind of fear, not the sharp fear of violence, but the crawling, endless discomfort of being consumed by small things. It wore down nerves. It made rest impossible. And sleep was already scarce. The Viet Cong also understood the importance of food and water. They knew that soldiers relied on supply drops and foraging when routes were compromised. So they turned hunger into another front of war. Poisoned rice was a common tactic. Sometimes they would intentionally leave behind sealed bags of rice or canned goods, perfectly preserved, with no signs of tampering, but laced with tasteless toxins. One such toxin caused stomach pain, diarrhea, and vomiting so severe that soldiers had to be airlifted out. Others caused blurred vision or hallucinations. It wasn't about killing. It was about creating chaos in the body and uncertainty in the mind. And when a platoon sees 2 or 3 men collapse after eating, they begin to fear every bite that follows. One case recorded in 1968 involved a South Vietnamese patrol finding a large cache of rice near the Mekong Delta. It seemed like a victory. They cooked it immediately. Within hours, 7 men were doubled over, 3 unconscious, and 1 in critical condition. Blood tests later revealed a concentrated dose of toxic mushrooms had been crushed and mixed into the grains perfectly. Invisible to the eye, water was even more vulnerable. Wells and rivers, especially in contested villages, were often dosed with herbs or roots that caused cramps and dehydration. In one area near the Cambodian border, an entire unit was brought down not by bullets, but by dysentery, caused by a poisoned water cache left behind by retreating Viet Cong. They knew the Americans would use it. They planned for it. And they didn't even need to watch the trap spring to know it had worked. Sabotage extended to personal hygiene as well. In some areas, the Viet Cong planted poisoned razors or toothbrushes among civilian homes, knowing American soldiers searching the buildings might take them. Even the soft comfort of shaving could be turned into a potential hazard. Imagine the panic of watching your hands swell after brushing your teeth, wondering what you touched, what you used, and how long you had left. Even latrines were not safe. In some units, soldiers reported finding traps laid inside or around. Latrine areas, punji stakes under toilet seats, tripwires near the entrance, or explosive devices buried in the waste pits. It's a grim irony that the one place meant for privacy and relief became another site of vigilance. Nothing was sacred. Nothing was safe. And the psychological toll was cumulative. Soldiers began to mistrust the world around them. They started skipping meals, drinking less water, or hoarding supplies in fear. Sleep was already light. Now it has become fragmented. The fear of waking up to pain or not waking up at all made soldiers twitch at every rustle, recoil at every breeze. The jungle, alive with sound, became a hall of whispers. Every chirp might be camouflage. Every stillness, a setup. And when you live in that level of alertness for long enough, the body begins to break down. The Viet Cong had succeeded in creating a battlefield where even survival was punishment. And perhaps the cruelest tactic of all was the use of baited sabotage. They would sometimes plant false intelligence radio frequencies, fake maps, counterfeit plans designed to lure American troops into ambushes or areas rigged with multi-layered traps. These weren't just physical tricks, they were trust bombs. Soldiers stopped believing what they were told. Orders were second-guessed. Rumors spread faster than clarity. The sense of direction, both literal and emotional, began to decay. In one documented incident, a radio frequency captured by American forces led them to believe that a high-value target was nearby. A team was dispatched. The trail was clean. The trees are too quiet. By the time the third man in the unit stepped into the trap, it was too late to retreat. The entire area had been rigged with sequential mines, each one triggered by the movement of a rescuer. The loss was not just tactical. It was mental. In debriefs, some soldiers wept not out of fear, but out of betrayal by the war itself. They weren't losing the guns. They were losing the ghosts. And these ghosts didn't fire back. They waited, hidden in the leaves, in the food, in the water, in the silence. As you rest deeper into your pillow, and the air around you grows still, try to imagine what it means to be hunted by a forest, to lie down and wonder if the tree above you is just a tree, or a silent witness to your last moment. In the next part, we'll explore how American and South Vietnamese forces tried to fight back, how they developed countermeasures, trained tunnel rats, built specialized gear, and used dogs and machines to survive this invisible war. Because as the traps grew smarter, so did the responses. For every trap that waited in silence beneath the leaves, there was a soldier assigned to find it first. For every shadow laced with wire or filled with venom, minds were working to understand and overcome. After months of injuries, ambushes, and psychological warfare, the American and South Vietnamese forces began to shift from reaction to adaptation. They couldn't remove the jungle, and they couldn't undo the fear, but they could begin to learn its language. As the number of casualties from hidden traps rose, new roles emerged within infantry units. Soldiers trained specifically to detect, defuse, and document Viet Cong devices. These men weren't just engineers. They were interpreters of silence, tasked with predicting where the enemy might hide their invisible weapons. They studied patterns. Which trails were too clean? Which rocks were freshly moved? What kind of leaf coverage was unnaturally neat? It was slow work, like walking into an unsolved riddle with blood on every wrong answer. The most basic tools were the oldest long sticks, usually sharpened metal rods, carried ahead of each step, used to gently probe the earth. Known casually as prodding sticks, these simple instruments were sometimes the only thing between a safe step and a screen. Soldiers learned to feel for the hollow thud of a false cover, or the sudden shift in resistance that meant something was hidden beneath the soil. It became a dance. 2 steps, stop, prod, scan, repeat. Every hour in, the jungle felt like a negotiation with fate. But even careful prodding wasn't always enough. So the military began to introduce more specialized devices. Mine detectors, similar to those used in earlier wars, were refined for the jungle's unpredictable terrain. These were often heavy, unwieldy, and imperfect metal components in Viet. Cong traps were minimal, so detectors missed many handmade devices crafted from bamboo or wood. Still, they helped in high-risk areas where metal shrapnel had already been discovered. To support these efforts, engineer units developed standard protocols, clearing paths with controlled detonations, spraying lines of brightly colored powder to mark cleared areas, and assigning soldiers to memorize every step taken during patrols. 1 foot placed wrong could undo an hour's work. Some units even mapped trap-prone zones, creating hand-drawn documents passed between platoons like whispered warnings. But the most dangerous job of all was given to the tunnel rats. These were soldiers, usually shorter and leaner, who volunteered or were assigned to crawl into the narrow Viet Cong tunnel systems, armed with little more than a flashlight, a pistol, and nerves made of steel. These men entered darkness, not knowing if a booby trap, a wild animal, or an enemy fighter was waiting only inches away. The tunnels were claustrophobic. The walls closed in around them. The air was thin. The floor might give way. The ceiling might hold a spike or wire. Every bend might hide a tripwire, a snake, or a gun barrel. There was no turning back, not without risking death. So the tunnel rats moved forward, inch by inch, their breath slow and quiet, their fingers brushing the walls for signs of recent use. Some carried a string to mark their way back. Others relied on memory. A few never returned. They became part of the maze they tried to understand. Those who survived became legends among their peers. Not for heroism in the traditional sense, but for enduring something that defied logic, a war beneath a war, fought by feel and breath alone. Above ground, another kind of ally was recruited. Dogs. Specially trained canines were introduced to sniff out traps, detect Viet Cong hiding places, and warn handlers of hidden dangers. These dogs, mostly German Shepherds or Labradors, were trained in the United States, flown to Vietnam, and paired with handlers who came to rely on them like extensions of their senses. The dogs learned to pause when they sensed tripwires, to sit quietly when they smelled explosives, and to growl low when someone was nearby. Their senses outmatched any technology, but they were not immune to the dangers. Traps were sometimes baited to kill dogs first. Some Viet Cong even used poisoned meat to lure and eliminate them. The bond between dog and handler was deep. Soldiers often reported sleeping with their dogs, talking to them when fear made human voices too sharp, and mourning them like family when they were lost. In many cases, it was the dog that saved an entire unit from walking into a trap. Alongside, dogs came protective gear adaptations in uniforms designed to reduce injuries from punji sticks, spikes, and barbed devices. Soldiers were issued boots with reinforced soles, often layered with metal or thick rubber to reduce the impact of sharp traps. Some units used makeshift shin guards, crafted from salvaged materials. Helmets were padded further. Vests were thickened, but mobility suffered. The thicker the armor, the slower the movement. And in the jungle, slow could mean dead. Still, these changes made a difference. Reports of serious foot injuries dropped slightly after reinforced boots were introduced, though infection and psychological trauma remained high. The gear could protect the body, but not the mind. Efforts to fight back didn't end on the battlefield. In the United States and allied countries, research teams and military engineers worked around the clock to develop better detection devices, more effective protective clothing, and new counter-trap technologies. Some developed remote-triggered sensors that could be tossed ahead of patrols and activated to set off potential traps from a safe distance. Others tested thermal imaging tools, hoping to detect disturbances in the ground that indicated buried devices. But few technologies were reliable in the heat, humidity, and dense vegetation of Vietnam. The jungle swallowed signals. It blurred lines. In the end, the most effective tools remained human. Caution, observation, and the shared experience of those who had already bled. Lessons were passed from squad to squad, often in the form of quiet briefings before patrols. Don't trust clearings, one might say. If it looks easy, it's wrong. Watch for bent grass, not just wires. If a body's lying too clean, it's not alone. These were mantras, not orders, and they became rituals. Soldiers developed pre-patrol routines, checking their boots, folding their socks a certain way, capping their helmet 3 times, repeating the names of fallen friends in whispered order. Superstition and memory blended into survival. And still, traps killed. Still, men fell. And every success in trap detection brought only momentary relief because the Viet Cong adapted too. They learned from American strategies. They moved traps to new areas. They used American-supplied materials to build more deadly devices. The war became not just about territory, but about staying one step ahead in an arms race of imagination. One officer famously said, "We are playing chess in a forest of shadows." And they've been here longer than we have. Now, as your breath deepens and your body rests more heavily into whatever comfort holds you tonight, you might begin to understand what it meant to survive a war that never shouted, only whispered. A war that reached out through the ground, the air, trees, and the silence. And yet, there's more to uncover. In the next part, we'll enter the stories of the men themselves, the voices of soldiers who saw the traps, triggered them, survived them, or never quite escaped them. We'll walk briefly in their boots, if only in memory. Because beneath every trap was a life forever changed dot in the end. It wasn't the jungle itself that did the most damage. It was what it left behind in the minds of those who walked through it. For all the clever countermeasures, the thick-soled boots, the probing sticks, the minesweepers and alert dogs, the most enduring stories of the Vietnam War's traps came from the mouths of the men who survived them. Their words, often simple and slow, carried more weight than the statistics. These were not generals or historians. They were tired voices from quiet hospital beds, bar stools, or late-night memories, speaking about a moment when the ground disappeared or a breath was stolen by something buried in silence. Take John Thompson, a young American infantryman who served in 1968, whose unit was sent to clear a seemingly abandoned trail near the Cambodian border. They moved slowly, their point man sweeping ahead with a metal rod, the jungle silent except for the occasional buzz of flies and the low rustle of their boots. Then something clicked. It wasn't loud more, like the snap of a pencil. Thompson turned his head just in time to see his friend drop to the ground, screaming, the lower part of his leg nearly severed. A spiked foot trap crude, rusted and soaked in decay. The rescue effort was immediate, panicked, and in Thompson's words, like trying to lift a man out of a bear trap while blindfolded. They used their shirts as bandages, cut bamboo to carry him, and radioed for medevac. The helicopter came, eventually, but the fear never left. After that, Thompson said years later, I looked at every leaf like it was a mouth ready to bite. Then there was James Walker, a reconnaissance scout whose job it was to move ahead of his platoon, unseen, unheard, and aware of everything. He had already disarmed 2 tripwires that week, narrowly avoiding disaster. But on a foggy morning near the village of Siu Chi, he felt something strange. A pull on his ankle, soft at first, then tight. He barely had time to shout when a bamboo whip trap slammed into his side, breaking 2 ribs and embedding a barbed spike into his shoulder. He survived. He carried the scars. But more than that, he carried the sensation of helplessness, of betrayal by the earth beneath him. For years after the war, Walker said he couldn't sleep on his back. The pressure reminded him of lying on the jungle floor, breath shallow, heart screaming. Others spoke of quieter injuries, those that didn't bleed but still bled into their lives. Patricia Johnson, a nurse stationed at a field hospital in Da Nang, saw dozens of trap victims each week. Some came with legs shattered by punji pits, others with eyes damaged by spring-loaded spikes, and a few who arrived silent, shaking, without a single mark on their bodies. There was one boy, she said, who just sat on the edge of the cot and cried. We checked him head to toe. Nothing. Not a scratch. But he'd seen his entire unit fall into a series of traps, one after another, each scream building on the last, until only he was left standing. That silence broke him more than any wound ever could. The soldiers didn't just fear injury. They feared watching others be hurt, and worse, being unable to help. There's something primal about watching a comrade cry out, reaching for you, and knowing that stepping closer might get you both killed. Many described it as a kind of freeze-a-war between instinct and training. Help him. No, stop. That ground looks wrong. That branch is out of place. The hardest part wasn't always the trap, it was the choice. And for some, That guilt never faded. Others recounted stories with surreal detail. A South Vietnamese interpreter named Nguyen Tuan spoke of the time his patrol discovered a child's doll in a clearing. Its porcelain face was cracked, one eye painted blue. It was clearly out of place. No houses nearby, no people for miles. But one young soldier, perhaps trying to cling to some softness in the war, picked it up. The explosion threw him 10 feet backward. The trap had been small, but enough to destroy his hand. After that, Nguyen said, none of us trusted anything that looked innocent. Even objects meant to signal peace or surrender were sometimes used as bait. A white flag on a stick, a dropped canteen, a letter in English, folded and pinned to, a tree. Soldiers were told to treat everything as a potential threat, and this slowly drained them of empathy, of hope. To survive, they had to stop seeing the world as a place filled with meaning and start seeing it as a puzzle filled with threats. One radio operator described it this way. We stopped seeing trees. We saw shapes, shadows, potential triggers. Even the sky began to feel like it might fall. Some stories were almost too strange to be believed. A Marine named Alex Hardy recounted the time his unit bivouacked in a spot they'd been told was secure. They lit cigarettes. They exhaled, finally, after a long day of cautious walking. Then, one man walked to relieve himself and didn't come back. A scream and silence. They found him face down, impaled by a spike hidden beneath a false rock. Near the latrine. The trap hadn't been designed to kill quickly. It had aimed for the stomach. A slow, cruel wound. Hardy said the unit didn't speak the rest of the night. No one used the latrine again. They simply held it in, like the breath they no longer trusted to release. Over time, these experiences layered themselves in the minds of those who lived them. Even after the war, decades later, some veterans said they couldn't walk in forests. Some avoided hiking trails, tall grass, and even playgrounds with wood chips. One man admitted he flinched every time he saw bamboo, no matter how neatly arranged in a garden. Another said he never walked barefoot again, not even in his own home. And these weren't weak men. They were survivors of a war that refused to be loud. They lived through ambushes without warning, booby traps without mercy, and a silence so thick it changed how they thought about sound forever. Some never got the chance to speak. Soldiers who triggered traps too well hidden, whose bodies were too damaged to recover, whose names were carved into stone, but whose final moments were known only by the jungle. And so the stories of survivors carry weight, not just their own, but the unspoken memories of those who never came back. Their testimonies, collected over the years in interviews, letters, and memoirs, serve as a different kind of battlefield map, one not drawn in lines, but in emotional scars. And each one reminds us that for every trap set by the Viet Cong, a story was changed, a path diverted, a soul altered in silence. Now, as your eyes grow heavier and the sound of the jungle fades into the soft rustle of your breath, consider what it means to carry memory, not in words, but in instinct. What it means to trust nothing, not even the soil. In the next part, we'll look beyond the soldiers and into the places themselves, the villages where traps were laid, the forests that still hide them, and the ways the land remembers long after the war ends. Because some traps don't rust. They root. They wait. If you walk the land long enough, you begin to feel that places remember, not in the way people do, with dates and names and clear pictures, but with textures and silences and odd hesitations. In the wind and in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the landscape holds a memory of the war that is deeper than any plaque or speech could offer. Rice paddies that look like mirrors in the morning keep small, careful distances from tree lines where patrols once moved. Paths curve around mounds that villagers won't level, not because they are sacred in a religious sense, but because everyone has heard at least one story about something buried beneath. And along canal banks the grass grows a little wilder, as if unwilling to flatten where feet once paused to listen. After the fighting ended, the fields did not simply become fields again, not right away, because the war had taught the earth to do more than feed people. It had taught it to hide. Things, swallow things, refused to give them back easily. The traps the Viet Cong laid were meant to wound and delay soldiers, but their echoes complicated civilian life for years. Farmers who planted seedlings with one hand kept the other hand free to test the soil with a stick. Children learned that some parts of a forest were quiet and other parts were too quiet, and everyone knew the rule that curiosity was dangerous. Do not lift the shiny can, do not tug the old wire, do not step where the weeds look too tidy. In some villages, elders developed careful rituals around the seasons before the first rains. Men would walk the dikes in a slow line, eyes down, saying little, nudging earth with bamboo poles to feel for hollows or new, unsettling lightness beneath a patch of dirt. At the edge of hamlets, where bomb craters filled with water and became ponds ringed by banana trees, fishermen cast their nets with a cautious arc, as if apologizing to the surface for disturbing it. Sometimes the landscape gave back the past on its own. A rusted spike rising from a bank after a flood, a trap frame exposed by a landslide, a length of wire combed up by a plow. And even when nothing emerged, people remembered what might be there, and that was enough to move fences a meter inward, to reroute a footpath, to teach a child an old warning in a new generation's soft voice. Time helped, but it did not erase what it did was soften the edges, make what was once terror into a practical caution, the way you learn to respect a river after it has taken someone you loved. In a few regions, teens came with gloves and careful hands and quiet methods, walking with long, deliberate patience, tapping, probing, lifting. Some were veterans who had returned to make peace with a world that had once hidden teeth. Others were locals who had lost family and knew where to look, not by maps, but by stories. There was a path here. The soldiers camped near that tamarind. Do not touch the mound beyond the mango. And so the clearing became not only work, but listening, a slow archaeology of fear. There were days when they found nothing and still felt that the day had been good, because nothing was in its own way a gift. And then there were days when a thin board gave way under a boot, not catastrophically anymore because ropes and pulleys and sandbags absorbed fall, but enough to remind everyone that the ground remembers. Across borders, the story rhymed with different verses. In Cambodia, museum rooms filled with diffused shells and photographs tell visitors what the countryside still quietly knows. In Laos, hills with beautiful names hold a quieter menace under. They're green, and villagers speak of seasons by the patterns of what may rise from the dirt after heavy rain. Commerce and memory intertwined in places like the Siu Chi district, where the tunnel mouths are now shown to tourists with guide voices soft as librarians. Please watch your step. This part is narrow. This is how smoke was vented. And yet, even in the careful choreography of demonstration pits and reconstructed trap frames, there is a hush that comes over the group when a guide lowers a leaf mat to reveal sharpened stakes below. No one needs to be told to imagine a foot. They imagine anyway. Some smile nervously. Some put a hand on a child's shoulder. A few step back without realizing it, as if their bodies know the old language of distance. The exhibits are an attempt to translate history into sight and touch, but the forest beyond the rails is the better teacher. Once you leave the paved loop and stand under the canopy, the air presses close, the light folds into green, and you understand why silence was both terrain and tactic. The land does not speak, but it does not lie either. It simply holds what it was given. In village homes near old battle spaces, you find the gentle stubbornness of daily life. Mothers washing rice, Grandfathers mending nets, teenagers scrolling on phones while a fan ticks softly. And yet, a shelf might hold a dented helmet repurposed as a flower pot. A doorstop might be a sanded, harmless fragment of a mine. A wall calendar might show the anniversary of a day when everyone stayed inside because the dogs were restless and the wind didn't ring the bamboo chimes the way it should have. Memory braids itself into normalcy until you can't find it. Seeing. The war is not the headline anymore, but it remains a margin note in chores. Dig carefully. Burn the brush pile in the field center, not at its edge. Call the elder before cutting a new path through scrub. And then there is the soil itself, dark, generous, layered, capable of astonishing forgiveness. Rice grows again. Cassava reaches down. Banana trees throw new leaves. And in harvest season, laughter moves across the paddies like a rare breeze. Resilience is not a slogan here. It is the rhythm by which people carry water and carry on. And yet the land's forgiveness has limits, because forgiveness is not forgetfulness. In some places, markers stand at the end of dirt roads. Simple concrete posts with dates, names, or just a warning painted in faded red. School teachers use them as lessons. We measure courage differently here, one might say, by patience, by noticing, by leaving some things untouched. You begin to see how the trap war changed not only armies, but the civilian vocabulary of caution. In regions where the old danger is smallest now, the memory survives as a kind of grace and attentiveness to small things. A footprint where none. Should be the way a leaf lies too flat, the way a fence leans as if reluctant. And it becomes clear that while the soldiers' stories traveled to books and interviews, the land's story stayed put, told in a grammar of mud and root and habit. Perhaps that is why visitors sometimes find themselves whispering in groves, without knowing why. The trees require it, or maybe the past does. Beyond Vietnam's borders, the echoes continue in quiet workshops where prosthetic limbs are measured and fitted, in clinics where old wounds meet new medicine, in community halls where maps with colored pins help planners choose the safest place to put a well, a road, a schoolyard. What war unmade, years of calm rebuild slowly, imperfectly, with tenderness that arrives one careful step at a time. And somewhere in this slow mending, there is also a kind of gratitude, not for the fear that once governed the earth, but for the skill that now reads it more kindly, the same habit of noticing that once saved patrols now saves farmers, children, travelers. The attention that was once muscle-tight and breath-shallow is now the gentler alertness of care. Look where you plant. Look where you walk. Look at the clouds and the color of water after rain. And if you listen long enough in the late afternoon, when the birds soften and the heat eases, you can almost hear the boundary between past and present ease as well. The place does not forgive because it is asked. It forgives because life insists. But there is one more layer to these landscapes, a darker seam at the base of the hills and under the schoolyards, the legal and moral aftershock that lingers when a war's devices outlive its politics. Who is responsible for a trap that injures? A farmer decades later, who pays for a child's surgery, who funds the training that teaches a new generation to read the ground the way soldiers once did. The answers are not simple, and so help arrives in Mosaic's local volunteers international. Teams, quiet donors, traveling trainers, each adding a careful square to a patient picture. And still, the land remains the main partner, patient, stubborn, capable of swallowing what must be swallowed and raising what must be raised when rain and time are ready. Perhaps that is why, when evening comes to places once thick with tripwires, people still sit outside and talk softly while the sky turns the color of old brass. The day is allowed to end. The ground is allowed to rest. And inside this ordinariness lies a victory that no one will ever record on a monument. Not conquest, not a banner planted, but a child running along a path that was once avoided, a grandmother planting herbs near a stump that once frightened her, a fisherman laughing because the pond gave up only fish today. The land remembers, yes, but it does not refuse healing. It only asks that we move kindly upon it. And as you breathe slower now, as the room around you grows quiet, let the rhythm of those small steps ease your own, because in the next part, we will return from the fields to the designs themselves, to the strange ingenuity that made simple materials so devastating, and to the paradox at the heart of this story. How a handful of wood, a length of wire, and a patient mind could change the movement of an army and the memory of a nation. The forest still has one more lesson to show us. Come a little closer, carefully, if you strip away the fear and the memories for just a moment. What remains in the Viet Cong's trap war is an odd kind of craftsmanship and ingenuity that took the simplest materials and turned them into weapons capable of halting the advance of a superpower. To study these devices now is to be reminded that technology is not always the deciding factor in war. Sometimes it is patience, resourcefulness, and an unshakable understanding of the land. Bamboo, wood, vines, nails scavenged from broken crates, wire pulled from abandoned fences, even pieces of unexploded ordnance. These became the building blocks of a hidden arsenal. The punji stake pit, so well known it became almost a symbol of the war, was a perfect example. Sharpened bamboo stalks, fire-hardened to strengthen them, set at angles so that a foot sliding in would be pierced in multiple places, the tips sometimes not pointing straight up but slanted, to tear more deeply when the victim tried to pull free. The coating of the stakes was often worse than the wound itself. Animal dung or rotting vegetation meant infection would set in quickly, sometimes within hours, making even minor punctures dangerous. But the punji pit was just the entry point into a whole category of mechanical thinking that blended simplicity with cruelty. There were tilting floor traps, where a false plank, balanced like a seesaw, would dump the victim onto spikes or into a pit. Step in the wrong place, and the weight of your own body became the trigger. There were whip traps made from bent bamboo, held in tension by vines, with their tips fitted with spikes, nails, or even fragments of glass. A tripwire would release them, and the stalk would snap forward with frightening speed, striking legs, torso, or face. Some were designed to knock a soldier backward into a second trap, a grim choreography of cause and effect. The grenade in a can was another notorious design. A hand grenade with its pin removed, secured inside a tin or jar so that the safety lever was held in place. A thin wire, sometimes almost invisible, would be stretched across a path, tied to the can. Step through the wire, the can tipped, the lever flew free, and the grenade detonated. This trap could be assembled in minutes from materials at hand, and left behind with little effort, yet it could kill or maim in an instant. The ingenuity lay in how these devices blended into the environment. Tripwires hidden in shadows, pits camouflaged with the same leaves that fell naturally, mechanisms concealed under mud or water. Soldiers learned that even familiar terrain could change overnight. A path used without trouble one day might be seeded with traps the next, forcing them to treat every return journey as if it were new. Some designs relied on gravity, heavy logs, or stones suspended above trails, released by a hidden trigger to swing or fall with lethal force. Others exploited water, as with submerged stake traps placed in rivers or ponds where soldiers might cross, the tips hidden just below the surface. There were even floating mines, made from oil drums or sealed containers that drifted into boat lanes. Many traps were designed not to kill outright, but to wound severely, knowing that a wounded soldier would require evacuation, tie up medical resources, and lower morale in his unit. A single injury could ripple through an entire operation, slowing movement, forcing diversions, and planting the seed of hesitation in every step that followed. Some were psychological more than physical. Decoy traps meant to be discovered, keeping soldiers on edge, or harmless-looking objects placed in suspicious locations to make them waste time and energy. The Viet Cong understood the power of suggestion. If a soldier believed an area was heavily trapped, he might move more slowly or avoid it entirely, without a single device being there. And yet, for all their simplicity, these devices were not crude. They were refined over years of trial, error, and adaptation. A trap that failed once might be redesigned overnight. Fighters shared successful designs with other units, spreading innovations through underground networks just as surely as weapons or ammunition. This adaptability meant that countermeasures were never final. American and South Vietnamese forces might learn to spot one kind of trap, only to find a modified version waiting weeks later. The creativity extended beyond the physical mechanisms. To their placement, traps were often positioned where they would have maximum effect on narrow trails, forcing single-file movement. At choke points like bridges or river crossings, in doorways, under windows, along likely escape routes. In some cases, multiple traps were layered together, one triggering another in a chain, designed to catch both the initial victim and anyone rushing to help. Imagine a soldier stepping into a pit, his comrades moving to pull him out, only to trip. A wire that releases a whip trap or detonates an explosive hidden nearby. The cruelty was deliberate, the design precise. Materials were often scavenged from the detritus of war itself. Shrapnel from unexploded bombs became spike tips. Discarded barbed wire was repurposed into entangling nets. Empty ammunition tins became casings for mines. Even unexploded shells could be dismantled for explosives. This recycling was born of necessity. The Viet Cong did not have the supply lines of their enemies, but it also spoke to a mindset that saw potential in everything left behind. The land itself was both workshop and warehouse. Bamboo was abundant, light, strong, and easy to work with. Vines provided flexible, durable bindings. Mud and leaves gave perfect camouflage. Even sound was considered in designing. Many traps were silent in operation, so that there would be no warning until it was too late. In the claustrophobic environment of the jungle, silence was as deadly as shrapnel. And yet, for all their technical cleverness, these devices were part of a broader philosophy of warfare. The goal was not to win through sheer destruction, but to erode the enemy's will to fight, to make every step forward feel costly, to turn the terrain itself into an ally. A trapped jungle was a jungle where the invader never felt safe, where rest was always interrupted by the need to check, to prod, to second guess. Over time, the traps became more than weapons. They became part of the soldier's mental landscape, shaping how they saw the world around them. Even decades later, veterans would recall not just the look of a whip trap or a punji pit, but the feeling of walking into an area that seemed wrong. The tension in the air, the way the leaves lay just a little too evenly. These were the signs. They learned to read, often too late. Now, when researchers and historians study these devices, they do so with a mix of technical curiosity and moral unease. The mechanics can be diagrammed, the triggers explained, but the human cost is harder to capture in a schematic. Each spike and wire carries a story, each pit a name that might never be known outside a family or a platoon. The ingenuity cannot be separated from the suffering it caused. And yet, to understand the war, one must understand these traps not just as artifacts, but as symbols of a conflict where the weaker side used every available resource to resist, and the stronger side was forced to fight not just an army, but a landscape transformed into a weapon. As your breathing slows, and you picture the quiet hands of someone bending over a patch of earth, setting a mechanism in place, covering it with leaves, you might wonder what drove such dedication. Such meticulous work for a device that might never even be triggered. In the next part, we'll turn to the strange paradox of these traps, how they could be both deeply personal and utterly impersonal, how they reflected the intimate knowledge of a soldier's path and yet treated any intruder as interchangeable, and how, in the stillness of the jungle, the line between defense and vengeance blurred until it was no longer clear who is hunting whom. Something is unsettling about the idea that a weapon can be built for no one in particular and yet feel personal to whoever meets it. The traps of the Vietnam War existed in this strange paradox, as if they were both intimate messages and faceless hazards. On one level, each device was impersonal in its operation. A spike pit would not care if the foot above it belonged to a young private on his first patrol, a veteran sergeant, or even an unlucky villager. The tripwire did not distinguish between uniforms or languages, and yet their placement often felt as though they had been set for you specifically, for the exact way you moved through the world. This duality was part of their power. The Viet Cong learned to study patterns, not just the geography of an area, but the human behavior moving through it. They knew that soldiers preferred certain approaches to a village, that a bend in a path would make a man glance to his left, that a slope would slow him down and change his stride. They took note of how patrols reacted to certain landmarks, how they skirted fallen logs, how they paused to check a clearing, how they relaxed slightly after moving past a suspected danger zone. And then the traps would appear in those places, of lowered guard, almost like the land itself had been watching you, waiting for you to breathe out. For the soldiers on the receiving end, this created the haunting feeling of being known, not as an individual, but as a type, someone whose actions could be predicted, whose fear could be anticipated. This eroded more than trust in the terrain. It eroded trust in the self. If you were predictable enough to be caught, then perhaps you weren't as careful as you thought. That doubt was a powerful weapon in itself. Some soldiers described feeling as if the traps were speaking to them, not in words, but in a kind of silent recognition. You thought you were safe here, a sprung whip trap might seem to say. You thought you understood the pattern. And for the man who survived the encounter, the message lingered long after the physical wounds healed. For the man who didn't, the message was delivered to his comrades instead. In this way, the traps created a network of psychological connections between moments and places. A certain tree line might forever be associated with the day a friend was maimed. A narrow bridge might feel cursed because the last crossing ended in blood. These associations spread like rumors, traveling faster than any formal report. Units entering a new area might be told to watch a specific bend in the river, not because it was still trapped, but because it had been once, and the memory alone was enough to slow them down. The impersonal became personal through repetition. Even the most standard designs, the punji pit, the grenade in a can, the whip trap, took on unique meaning depending on where they were encountered and who was lost to them. The effect was cumulative. After months of patrols, a soldier might carry a mental map, not just of terrain, but of places where the war had reached out to touch him. This mental map often persisted long after the war ended. Veterans spoke of walking through parks, gardens, or forests back home and feeling echoes of those old pathways, how a certain arrangement of leaves could make them pause, how a narrow gap between two trees might pull at some buried instinct to check for wires. This enduring vigilance was both a survival skill and a wound. For the Viet Cong, this layering of physical and emotional impact was deliberate. The traps were not meant to be fair fights. They were meant to be reminders that the war was everywhere and could appear without warning. They blurred the line between the battlefield and the rest of the world. Soldiers were trained to expect danger in combat zones, but the traps turned any place into a combat zone. Even when a village seemed calm, even when the children played in the open, the possibility of a hidden device was never absent. This tension served a strategic purpose. It forced the enemy to carry the battlefield inside themselves, to remain in a state of readiness that trained them over time. And because the traps could not be reasoned with, they also blurred the line between revenge and defense. For the man who built a trap, there was no guarantee it would catch the person he envisioned. Perhaps it was intended for the unit that burned his village. Perhaps it would strike strangers instead. Over time, the act of setting the trap became both deeply personal and offering of time, skill, and intent, and entirely detached from its eventual victim. This detachment could be protective for the maker, a way of avoiding the moral weight of seeing the result. But for the man who encountered it, there was no such distance. The pain, the fear, the loss, it all felt directed at him in that moment. This collision of personal impact and impersonal design made the traps uniquely haunting. In interviews, decades later, some veterans said they could still recall the exact positions of their hands and feet in the seconds before a trap was triggered, as if their bodies had frozen those coordinates into memory. Others remembered the sounds, the faint snap of a vine breaking, the whisper of leaves moving without wind, the sharp intake of breath from the man ahead of them. These sensory fragments became permanent entries in the catalog of their minds. In this way, the traps were both mechanical devices and emotional events. They were experienced not just through sight and touch, but through anticipation, shock, and aftermath. The personal connection came not from the intent of the maker, but from the intimacy of the moment itself, the closeness of the device, the immediacy of its action, the physical invasion of space and body. A bullet might come from far away. A trap was right there with you. This nearness made it harder to forget. And perhaps that was the most profound success of the trap war. It did not require constant engagement to be effective. A single encounter could shape behavior for months, even years. Soldiers began to avoid certain postures, certain steps, and certain kinds of terrain. This in turn affected operations, slowed progress, and eroded morale. The war could move on, without the trap needing to be reset. The memory did the work. Now, as you let these details settle into the quiet of your breathing, consider how strange it is that something as simple as sharpened bamboo or a bent sapling could have such a lasting impact, not only in the moment of injury, but in the reshaping of how a person occupies space in the world. In the next part, we'll step back from the immediate field and look at the broader context, how the use of traps fit into the overall Viet Cong strategy, how it complemented guerrilla tactics, and how it forced their opponents to fight a war on terms they never wanted. Because the traps were never just about the ground beneath you, they were about controlling the pace, the direction, and even the thoughts of an advancing army. By the midpoint of the war, the Viet Cong's trap network was no longer a scattered set of improvised hazards. It had evolved into an integrated system that worked hand in hand with every other element of their guerrilla strategy. The traps were not deployed in isolation. They were part of a larger choreography of movement, deception, and psychological manipulation. Imagine for a moment that you are a soldier moving through dense jungle, your boots sinking slightly into wet soil with every step. The air is thick, damp, and filled with the distant hum of unseen insects. You've been on edge for hours, your eyes scanning the undergrowth for signs of danger. And then, without warning, your unit is fired upon from a hidden position. The instinct is to drop to the ground, to find cover, but here's where the trap system worked its cruel magic. The Viet Cong often positioned traps in the very places soldiers would instinctively dive for safety. A patch of foliage that looked like solid ground might conceal a camouflaged pit. A cluster of tree roots could hide sharpened spikes angled to impale a man as he fell. The firefight would end quickly sometimes after only a few shots, but the damage was done. The enemy had been forced into danger by their survival instincts, and the attackers could vanish back into the terrain before any counteraction was possible. This was the genius of integrating traps into combat. They amplified the danger of every reaction, turning the natural rules of engagement against the soldiers who followed them. But the traps did more than punish. Immediate reflexes they shaped, the long-term rhythm of movement through contested areas. Entire patrol routes were altered because of suspected trap zones. Even without visual confirmation, the mere possibility of a device being hidden nearby was enough to change behavior. This slowing of movement was critical to the Viet Cong's broader goals. The longer an enemy patrol took to cross a given stretch of land, the more time there was to reposition forces, move supplies, and prepare ambushes elsewhere. The jungle was a living map, constantly adjusted in response to enemy movement, and the traps acted as both markers and deterrents within that map. Soldiers learned to recognize trap country, not by finding the devices themselves, but by noticing patterns in the landscape, places where paths narrowed, where the ground dipped suddenly, where vines hung lower than expected. Sometimes these signs were real, sometimes they were planted as decoys. The uncertainty was as powerful as the devices themselves. This uncertainty was magnified by the Viet Cong's deliberate use of variety. They never relied on a single design for long. Just as soldiers began to feel they understood the telltale signs of one type of trap, a new variation would appear. Punji pits would be replaced by toe-popper mines. Whip traps would give way to grenade-in-a-can setups. Even the simplest devices could be modified in countless ways. Different angles of spikes, different triggering mechanisms, different camouflage materials. This constant evolution kept the enemy in a state of learning, forcing them to approach each step as if it were the first time. It was not enough to have survived a certain kind of trap before. There was no guarantee the next one would behave the same way. The war became a kind of endless examination, each patrol a test with questions you couldn't prepare for in the broader context of guerrilla warfare. This adaptability mirrored the Viet Cong's overall approach. They did not seek to overpower the enemy in direct battle. They sought to outlast them, to exhaust them physically and mentally. Every trap that wounded a soldier forced the enemy to divert resources for evacuation, treatment, and recovery. Every patrol slowed by the need to check for traps reduced the pace of operations. Every detour forced by a suspected hazard gave the Viet Cong more time to reposition. The traps were, in essence, a form of time-theft, small investments of labor and material that stole hours, days, and sometimes weeks from the enemy's campaign. The Siu Chi tunnels played a central role in supporting this trap network. These underground passageways were not only safe havens for fighters, but also workshops where devices could be built, repaired, and stored away from enemy eyes. Here, in dimly lit chambers smelling of earth and metal, artisans of war shaped bamboo into spikes, carved grooves to increase their penetrating power, and coated them with toxins sometimes natural, like plant sap or animal venom, sometimes bacterial, using soil from latrine pits. The tools for digging, cutting, and binding were simple, but the skill lay in precision. A trap had to be balanced between concealment and effectiveness. Too obvious, and it would be avoided. Too hidden, and it might fail to trigger when needed. The tunnel system allowed for this careful calibration to be done without interference. From the tunnels, traps could be moved into position through concealed exits, often during the night. The Viet Cong preferred to place them quietly, under the cover of darkness, sometimes within hearing distance of enemy positions. This proximity was not just a logistical choice, it was a form of psychological warfare. Knowing that the enemy could work so close without being detected added a layer of paranoia to every soldier's thoughts. If they could set a trap here, so near to camp, then there was no such thing as a safe zone. The integration of traps into the larger war effort also extended to intelligence gathering. Whenever a trap was sprung, but not destroyed, it provided clues about enemy movement. If a punji pit was triggered on a certain path, the Viet Cong could infer the direction, timing, and possibly even the size of the patrol. These data points informed future placements, making the trap network self-improving over time. In this way, the devices were not just weapons, but sensors, silent recorders of enemy behavior. And yet, for all their strategic value, the traps remained profoundly personal in their effects. Each one represented a moment of danger that could alter a man's life forever. The injury itself was only part of the story. The memory of where it happened, how it happened, and who was there at the time often carried equal weight. Soldiers returning from Vietnam spoke of certain places with a mixture of bitterness and awe, as though the ground itself had agency, as though it had chosen to resist them. As we move into the next part of our story, we will step into one of those places in more detail, a village where every approach had been turned into a gauntlet, where even the water sources were trapped, and where the fight for survival was not just against an enemy you could see, but against an invisible web of devices woven into the very fabric of daily life. It was in places like this that the war's unique blend of patience, skill, and ruthlessness revealed itself most clearly. And once you've seen how such a village operated, you may begin to understand why the war in Vietnam was not only fought in battles, but in every cautious footstep a soldier took. The village seemed almost ordinary from a distance. Low thatched roofs scattered between clusters of banana trees, the faint smell of cooking fires drifting on the damp air. Yet for those who knew its history, it was less a settlement and more a labyrinth of danger. Every approach had been transformed into a gauntlet, each foot of ground calculated to test and punish intrusion. Soldiers who entered here did so with a quiet, unnatural gait, as though walking across the surface of a frozen pond. The Viet Cong had long understood that villages were not just places to live, but living fortresses, and this one had been prepared for years to resist. The first line of defense began well before the houses came into view. Narrow paths leading in were flanked by vegetation that concealed whip traps, bent saplings, fitted with sharpened stakes or weighted clubs, all held in place by tensioned vines. The moment a soldier's boot pressed on the wrong spot, the vine would snap free, releasing the weapon with enough force to break bone. In some cases, these traps were positioned deliberately off the main path to catch anyone attempting to sneak around suspected danger. This layering of visible and invisible hazards forced patrols to move slowly, checking every inch of ground, every branch, every suspicious depression in the earth. Once the outer ring was crossed, the terrain shifted into a more intimate kind of danger. Small water crossings, narrow streams, or ditches were rigged with devices hidden beneath the surface. A soldier wading through waist-deep water might feel a sudden sting as sharpened stakes, fixed at an upward angle, drove into the soles or sides of his legs. The pain was immediate, but the true danger came later when infection set in. Even a minor wound could disable a man in a humid environment where medical evacuation was slow and supplies scarce. The Viet Cong relied heavily on this delayed effect. A trap did not need to kill outright to achieve its purpose. If one soldier in a unit were injured, the others would be slowed, morale would drop, and resources would be diverted closer to the heart of the village. The traps became more intimate still, integrated into the fabric of daily life. Wells were sometimes ringed with hidden tripwires, so that anyone approaching carelessly could trigger a weighted board studded with spikes, swinging down from above. Food storage huts might have concealed pits at their entrances, ensuring that even a place of supposed safety could betray the unwary. And then there were the door traps, simple devices using grenades or mines tied to thin lines so that opening a door without care would trigger a deadly blast. These were rarely left in place permanently. Instead, they were set when an attack was expected and removed when the threat passed. This made them unpredictable and therefore far more dangerous. For the villagers themselves, navigating this web of hazards required an intimate knowledge of placement and timing. Children grew up learning which stones to step on when crossing a certain path, which parts of the ground to avoid after heavy rain, when a certain stretch of bamboo fence might be rigged, and when it would be safe. This shared knowledge acted as an invisible shield for the community, allowing them to move with confidence in spaces that outsiders could only enter with fear. For enemy forces, this meant they were never just fighting armed combatants. Were moving through a living environment that sided against them. From a tactical standpoint, the village's trap system also allowed the Viet Cong to fight asymmetrically. They could engage in brief, intense bursts of combat and then withdraw, knowing the traps would continue the fight in their absence. If soldiers attempted to give chase, the very ground they ran over might rise against them. In some cases, a retreat was designed specifically to lead pursuers into prepared zones where multiple traps could be triggered in quick succession. The effect was both physical and psychological. Even if no one was injured, the mere experience of moving through such a place could leave soldiers jumpy, distracted, and far more vulnerable to mistakes. One particularly infamous tactic in villages like this was the nested trap design. A seemingly obvious hazard, like a visible punji pit, would be placed in plain sight, encouraging soldiers to detour around it. But the detour route itself would be lined with more subtle, better hidden devices. This manipulation of choice exploited the human tendency to assume that the visible danger is the greatest one, when in reality, it was merely bait. Veterans later spoke of feeling herded by the terrain, as if unseen hands were guiding them along. Paths chosen for their vulnerability. Inside the village, even when no active combat was occurring, the traps served as constant reminders of the Viet Cong's presence and control. Soldiers quartered in such places could never truly relax. A moment of inattention while walking to fetch water, a careless step while cutting through a courtyard, either could bring sudden injury. This constant tension eroded morale and could create divisions within units as men began to question each other's vigilance. Commanders sometimes found it difficult to motivate troops to operate in such areas at all, knowing that the environment itself was as much an enemy as the fighters who lived there. For the villagers, the trap network was both a blessing and a burden. It offered protection against outside forces, but demanded discipline, memory, and cooperation. Miscommunication could be deadly. In the fog of war, there were occasions when even locals fell victim to their defenses, especially if traps had been modified or relocated without everyone's knowledge. Such accidents were tragic, but the alternative, leaving the village unprotected, was considered far worse. From the perspective of the broader war, villages like this demonstrated the Viet Cong's mastery of using limited resources to maximum effect. A handful of bamboo stakes, a few scraps of metal, some rope or vine, these could be transformed into a defense system that rivaled, in effectiveness, far more expensive conventional fortifications. More importantly, they could be built and maintained quietly, without the need for large-scale infrastructure that might draw enemy attention. The jungle and the village architecture themselves became part of the weapon, blurring the line between civilian and military space in ways that made traditional combat doctrine almost useless. In the next part, we will leave this fortified village and follow a patrol attempting to move through a stretch of countryside so saturated with traps that it was known among soldiers as the corridor of ghosts. Here, every sound, every shadow, and every shift in the air seemed to carry the memory of past injuries, and even the most seasoned troops felt the pressure of walking through a place where countless feet had stepped and countless traps had waited. This was not just a stretch of land, it was a record of war etched into soil and bamboo, and it would test the limits of patience, courage, and the human capacity for caution. They called it the Corridor of Ghosts, not because of any visible sign of death, but because of the strange silence that clung to it. The jungle here grew thick and uneven, its canopy so dense that sunlight only seeped through in broken shards, painting the ground in restless patterns of light and shadow. It was a place where sound seemed to vanish before it could carry, where even the wind moved cautiously, disturbing only the uppermost leaves. For those sent to cross it, the silence was more than unsettling. It was a warning. This stretch of countryside had been the site of dozens of small skirmishes and ambushes over the years. But what made it infamous was not the battles themselves. It was the network of traps laid so intricately into the landscape that they seemed less like man-made devices and more like an instinctive defense of the earth itself. Soldiers stepping into the corridor knew they were entering a place where the ground had a memory, and where every footstep carried the weight of all the footsteps. Before it, the approach began deceptively. The path looked like any other jungle track, narrow but well-worn, the soil packed down by years of use. In reality, the first 100 meters served as a psychological priming zone. The Viet Cong often left this section completely clear of traps, allowing patrols to build a dangerous rhythm, a sense that perhaps the corridor's reputation was exaggerated. It was only after this stretch that the first hazards began to appear, and by then, soldiers' vigilance had often dulled just enough for the danger to take hold. The earliest traps were small, almost gentle compared to what lay ahead foot. Snare loops hidden beneath a scattering of leaves, designed to trip and disorient rather than maim. But these were not meant to injure so much as to disrupt spacing and coordination within the patrol, making them more vulnerable to what followed. Beyond this point, the real corridor began. Punji pits were placed with surgical precision along both the path and its edges, their spikes angled in different directions to maximize injury no matter how a person fell. Some were shallow and designed to wound the lower legs, others deep, enough to engulf a man. The pits were often disguised with lightweight covers of woven bamboo, overlaid with a thin layer of soil and plant debris that blended seamlessly with the surrounding ground. Soldiers trained to spot such signs sometimes caught the faint give of the cover beneath their boots, but more often the first indication came too late. A sudden collapse, the sharp pain of impact, the shouted warnings to those behind. In between these more obvious hazards lie the subtler ones. Whip traps, bent saplings armed with sharpened stakes, were positioned to sweep across the path at waist or chest height, capable of breaking ribs or puncturing lungs. Grenade-in-a-can devices were hidden in tree roots or hollow logs, triggered by near-invisible tripwires strung at ankle height. Even the trees themselves were sometimes weaponized, with heavy branches weakened so they could fall at the slightest touch. Every trap was placed with a craftsman's eye, designed to blend perfectly with its surroundings. The Viet Cong who prepared the corridor treated it not as a series of random devices, but as a flowing sequence, each hazard positioned to exploit. The reactions caused by the last the psychological toll of moving through this environment was immense. Soldiers advanced in tight, deliberate steps, their eyes flicking constantly between the ground, the undergrowth, and the branches above. The act of scanning for danger became exhausting, and in that exhaustion lay the real risk. Attention drifted, and a single missed detail could mean disaster. Sometimes the most dangerous trap was not the one that was sprung, but the one that was spotted just in time. Spotting a near-miss sharpened fear reminded the patrol of their vulnerability and made them second-guess every movement thereafter. One tactic used here was the false alarm zone, a section thick with harmless tripwires, planted to create tension without immediate injury. These false hazards forced soldiers to slow to a crawl, hyper-focusing on every vine and shadow, until they reached a point where speed became a survival instinct again. That was when the true danger appeared. Clusters of concealed toe-popper mines, barely the size of a cigarette pack, buried just beneath the surface. A single misstep on one of these could remove a foot or lower leg, and their small size made them almost impossible to detect without probing the ground inch by inch. This grueling advance was compounded by the constant uncertainty of direction. The Viet Cong had long ago reshaped the path's geometry, adding subtle bends and forks that led into more dangerous ground. Maps were useless here. The jungle shifted too quickly, paths overgrown or rerouted in ways that seemed almost deliberate. Even the most experienced trackers could be led into dead ends where every available escape route was mined or trapped. It was a living maze, designed not just to harm, but to control the movement of those who entered it. For the fighters who maintained the corridor, the work was never finished. Traps degraded over time, wood rotted, vines frayed, soil shifted, and so the corridor was constantly refreshed, repaired, and in some cases, redesigned to keep ahead of enemy countermeasures. This maintenance work was done quietly, often by small teams moving at night, their movements masked by the natural noise of the jungle. The placement of traps followed no fixed pattern. One week's safe zone could be next week's killing ground. This fluidity made it impossible for enemy forces to memorize the corridor's layout, ensuring that each crossing was as dangerous as the first. The corridor's deadliness lay not only in its traps, but in its role as part of a larger operational design. Patrols slowed or halted here, gave the Viet Cong time to reposition, prepare ambushes, or move supplies undetected. The corridor was as much a tool of time control as it was of injury. And when fighting did erupt, the traps became force multipliers, channeling enemy movement into predictable lanes where firepower could be concentrated. Those who survived crossing the corridor rarely forgot the experience. Many spoke of the eerie quiet, the sensation that the jungle itself was watching, the way the ground seemed to breathe underfoot. Even years later, some veterans claimed they could still feel the tension in their calves and shoulders, the phantom ache of moving inch by inch through a place where death could be hidden beneath the most ordinary-looking leaf dot in the next part. We will follow the story beyond the corridor, into the sprawling Siu Chi tunnel region that underpins so much of the Viet Cong's trap strategy. There, the war shifted from the open jungle into a shadowed underworld, a place where the same principles of patience, concealment, and psychological pressure were amplified in darkness, and where the traps were not laid on the ground beneath your feet, but in the very walls and ceilings around you. The entrance to the Siu Chi tunnel network could be so small and well concealed that even standing directly over it, a soldier might see nothing but an unbroken carpet of jungle floor. A patch of grass here, a layer of dead leaves there, perfect camouflage that blended seamlessly into the earth. The Viet Cong designed these portals to be only slightly wider than a man's shoulders, forcing anyone who entered to do so slowly, deliberately, and with no hope of a quick escape if danger appeared. For them, these tunnels were lifelines, supply routes, meeting halls, sleeping quarters, and battle positions all rolled into one subterranean maze. For their enemies, they were a nightmare, a place where the air was heavy, the light absent, and every surface might be rigged to wound or kill. Moving from the open jungle into this underground world was like stepping into another dimension, one where sound was muffled, distance distorted, and the sense of direction quickly unraveled. The first section of most tunnels was deliberately narrow and low, requiring a crouch or crawl. This wasn't only to save space, it was also a defensive design. Any intruder moving through in such a position was vulnerable, unable to raise their weapon freely, and forced to focus their eyes and hands on each inch ahead. Here, The Viet Cong employed their smallest, simplest traps, sharpened bamboo stakes, angled just enough to scratch or puncture a knee or forearm, strands of thin wire strung at neck height in pitch darkness, small pits in the floor covered with woven matting that would collapse under even a cautious touch. Individually, these were not always lethal, but in the confines of the tunnel, even a minor injury could be debilitating, slowing progress and amplifying fear. Light inside was scarce, and in some sections, non-existent. The darkness was not accidental. The tunnels were dug with sharp turns every few meters, preventing light from carrying far, even if an intruder brought a torch. These turns were also tactical. A straight tunnel was easier to fire down, while a winding one forced attackers into constant stops and starts. Around some corners, the Viet Cong placed low openings in the floor or ceiling that led to side chambers. These could hold fighters ready to attack from behind once the intruders had passed, or they could contain traps. A common device in such spaces was the door trap, in miniature weighted boards studded with spikes, set to swing down silently onto the head or shoulders of whoever entered. Further in, the tunnels became more complex. Multi-level designs allowed defenders to vanish downward or upward without warning, leaving pursuers disoriented. Vertical shafts were sometimes flooded deliberately, creating water traps where a man might have to submerge completely in darkness to continue forward, risking drowning if panic set in. In other places, pits were dug and lined with punji stakes, then covered so seamlessly that a crawling soldier's first warning would be the sudden drop beneath them. The tunnels also incorporated psychological traps, false routes that ended in dead ends, walls of soft earth that looked diggable but led nowhere, chambers filled with nothing but rats or snakes to trigger fear and hesitation. In one particularly cruel design, the Viet Cong would place a live, agitated snake inside a small bamboo cage just behind a thin, breakable barrier in the wall. A soldier probing the wall with his hands could easily break the barrier, releasing the snake into the confined space. The snake did not need to bite to be effective. Its sudden, frantic presence was enough to create chaos. Perhaps the most infamous feature of the Chi network was the fighting chamber, a small, low room positioned just beyond the choke point, where the Viet Cong could wait silently, knowing that intruders would have to enter single file. From this position, they could use spears, knives, or even pistols at close range, often before the enemy could even raise their weapon. In some cases, the entrance to such a chamber was itself booby-trapped, so that the first soldier in line might be killed or injured before ever seeing who attacked. Life for the Viet Cong inside these tunnels was harsh, but they adapted. They knew every inch of the maze by touch, could navigate in near total darkness, and had memorized the positions of their traps so they could move quickly when needed. They developed routines to minimize the risk of accidents. Certain passages were used only at certain times. Traps were checked and reset regularly, and communication signals were standardized to avoid confusion. Still, the risk was never zero. Even a defender could trip a wire or misjudge a step in the cramped, shifting earth. For U.S. and South Vietnamese tunnel rats, the soldiers tasked with entering and clearing these spaces, the danger was relentless. Armed with only a flashlight, a pistol, and a knife, they moved into an environment designed entirely to favor the defenders. Every breath felt thick with earth. Every sound was magnified by the enclosed space, and every moment carried the possibility of sudden violence. Some traps were designed specifically to exploit this tension, like a decoy wire placed at eye level to draw attention, while the real tripwire lay hidden at knee height, a few inches ahead. The tunnels were more than a physical structure. They were an extension of the Viet Cong strategy, blending defense, offense, and psychological warfare into a single environment. They allowed fighters to appear where least expected, vanish without a trace, and survive in areas that seemed impossible to hold. Even when UC forces found and destroyed sections of the network, the damage was often temporary. New sections could be dug, old ones reconnected, and traps reset. For those who survived exploring them, the memory of the tunnels lingered long. After the war, veterans spoke of the smell, a mix of damp soil, sweat, and the faint tang of rusting metal from the traps. They remembered the feeling of moving forward into total darkness, every nerve alive with the awareness that the next inch could hold injury or death. And they remembered the oppressive stillness, broken only by the distant, muffled sounds of life continuing somewhere deeper within the maze. In the next part, we will emerge from the tunnels and see how the Viet Cong's trap tactics extended to the open countryside through a network of fake trails, false signs, and lure points areas. Designed to convince enemy patrols they were moving safely while guiding them straight into carefully prepared kill zones where nature, deception, and human ingenuity combined to devastating effect. When the war shifted from dense jungle interiors to the broader countryside, the Viet Cong did not abandon their trap tactics. They simply adapted them to a new, more open environment. Fields, rice paddies, narrow dirt lanes, and seemingly empty clearings all became part of a living chessboard, where every move was influenced by the placement of invisible threats. In these open areas, concealment relied less on dense foliage and more on blending with the daily rhythms of rural life. A path might be left untouched for weeks so that villagers, livestock, and even enemy patrols would come to trust it, only for it to be subtly altered one night to lead into danger. What made these rural traps so effective was not just their physical design, but the way they manipulated perception, making soldiers feel they were in control until the moment they realized they were not. The most common form of countryside deception was the false safe route. Viet Cong scouts studied enemy movement patterns, identifying paths soldiers preferred for their apparent safety. These routes were then subtly reshaped. A bend might be added where none had been before, a fork introduced with one direction disguised as the obvious choice, or a new footpath worn just enough to look natural. The goal was to steer patrols toward areas already seeded with traps. Sometimes the traps were obvious only in retrospect. A grenade in a can hidden under a shallow mound of earth, a buried mine covered with a thin layer of dry soil carefully matched to its surroundings, or a tripwire loop so low and fine it caught on the top of a boot without the soldier even feeling it until it was too late. It's too late. Rice paddies presented their opportunities. The standing water concealed a variety of hazard-spiked pits positioned where patrols were likely to wade, small explosive devices buried just below the mud, or even floating bamboo platforms with concealed spikes that would tilt when stepped on. These traps were particularly cruel because in many cases, the injury occurred out of sight of the rest of the patrol. A soldier might cry out from a sudden wound while still waist-deep in muddy water, and rescuers would be forced to approach cautiously, unsure of where it was safe to step. In more open fields, the Viet Cong often used lure points, places designed to draw the enemy in. An abandoned hut with the door ajar, a pile of fresh supplies left conspicuously in the open, or even the illusion of a recently abandoned camp could serve as bait. Inside or around these sites, the traps varied from simple to elaborate. A hut might conceal a trapdoor over a spiked pit, its wooden planks weakened to break under weight. A crate of supplies could be rigged with a pressure release trigger connected to a grenade. In some cases, the bait was nothing more than a line of footprints leading into tall grass, footprints made deliberately heavy to suggest haste, curiosity, or retreat, and which led straight into an area seeded with toe popper mines or tripwires. One of the most psychologically effective tactics in the countryside was the use of memory traps. The Viet Cong would sometimes plant devices in a location and leave them untouched for weeks or even months. Patrols passing through multiple times without incident would come to regard the area as safe. Then, without warning, the traps would be activated perhaps overnight, or during a period of bad weather when soldiers were less vigilant. This shattered the illusion of predictability and forced enemy forces to treat every location as dangerous, even if they had walked it 100 times before. Animals, too, were sometimes part of the rural trap strategy. Water buffalo tethered in seemingly random positions could serve as living markers for safe or unsafe zones. In some cases, the animals themselves were used to trigger traps ropes tied to their harnesses, connected to tripwires stretched across nearby paths, so that a sudden movement could set off a device without the enemy realizing the source. Dogs or roosters might be used to create false alerts, distracting soldiers from the real danger nearby. The countryside also allowed for larger, more theatrical trap designs. One such device was the rolling log trap, which used a slope and gravity to deadly effect. Heavy logs studded with spikes were positioned on raised platforms along a hillside, held in place by a simple locking mechanism connected to a tripwire. When triggered, the logs would roll down toward the path below with crushing force. Another was the net drop, in which a section of foliage overhead concealed a weighted net lined with spikes or barbs. When released, it would drop directly onto the patrol, entangling and injuring them at the same time. For the soldiers tasked with patrolling these areas, the tension was unrelenting. Every step across a rice paddy, every approach to a solitary hut, every movement through tall grass carried the possibility of hidden danger. The countryside's open expanses might seem safer than the claustrophobic tunnels or shadowed jungle, but in truth, the openness often made it worse. There was no way to scan every inch of ground, and the knowledge that danger could be anywhere gnawed at concentration dot. Even when traps failed to injure, they achieved their purpose. A patrol that slowed to probe the ground or dismantle a suspected device was a patrol that could be observed, tracked, and potentially ambushed. In this way, the traps served as both weapons and tools of strategy, controlling not just the battlefield, but the pace and direction of the war itself. In the next part, we will move from the fields into the waterways, exploring how rivers, canals, and even flooded plains became battlegrounds in their own right, with traps designed to turn the natural flow of water into an ally, concealing deadly devices beneath its surface and making even a simple crossing a nerve-wracking ordeal. In the Mekong Delta and countless other watery veins running through Vietnam, the war took on an entirely different character. Here, the water itself became both a shield and a weapon, and the Viet Cong learned to manipulate its depths and currents to their advantage. To the untrained eye, a river was simply a river brown, slow-moving in some stretches, fast and narrow in others. But to those who understood its potential, every bend, every submerged root, and every patch of floating vegetation was a potential trap site. Unlike jungle or open countryside, waterways forced soldiers into predictable channels of movement. Boats could not simply veer into the dense banks without risk of grounding, and swimmers were limited to the most accessible crossings. This predictability made them ideal for setting up carefully concealed devices that could maim, sink, or at the very least, frighten an enemy into hesitating. The most common waterborne trap was the floating mine, often crafted from salvaged materials like oil drums, bamboo frames, or hollowed gourds. Inside, explosives were packed with just enough buoyancy control to keep the device hidden just below the surface. Sometimes these mines were tethered loosely, drifting with the current, so they would bump into the sides of boats with unnerving unpredictability. Other times, they were anchored at choke points, narrow stretches of river, or the approaches to bridges, where the enemy had no choice but to pass close by. The danger lay not only in the explosive itself, but in the uncertainty it created. Even a suspected mine could halt a convoy, leaving it vulnerable to attack from the shore. Another favored device was the submerged spike trap. Long bamboo poles, hardened in fire and sharpened to wicked points, were driven into the riverbed at an angle, their tips hidden just below the waterline. Boats passing overhead could have their hulls punctured, and swimmers unlucky enough to encounter them risked impalement. In some versions, the spikes were tipped with metal scraps or coated in substances designed to cause infection, ensuring that even a glancing wound could become serious. In tidal areas, these traps were sometimes set to be fully hidden at high tide, then exposed at low tide, creating a constantly shifting hazard that even locals had to navigate with care. One of the more ingenious designs took advantage of the region's abundant vegetation. Clumps of water hyacinth or other floating plants were gathered and bound together around a concealed frame, within which was hidden either a mine or a tangle of barbed wire. From a distance, the mass looked entirely natural, just another drifting patch of greenery among hundreds. A boat attempting to push through might find its propeller fouled or its hull pierced, leaving it dead in the water and vulnerable to ambush. Rope and trigger devices were also adapted for waterways. A rope or vine stretched just beneath the surface could be attached to a mechanism on the riverbank, where a concealed operator could pull it tight as a boat approached, activating a connected mine or releasing a volley of small, sharpened stakes into the water. These traps required patience and timing, but when executed correctly, they could disable or destroy a vessel in moments. Even natural water features were weaponized. In some areas, narrow canals were dammed overnight, with the flow redirected to create sudden shallows or unexpected currents. Patrol boats navigating these channels would find themselves slowed or pushed off course, often toward areas where other traps had been planted. The element of control over movement was key. The Viet Cong didn't need to trap every boat they just needed to create enough uncertainty to make each passage a calculated risk. For foot soldiers, water crossings were even more dangerous. Bridges, when present, were often mined, but more often they were destroyed entirely, forcing troops to ford rivers or wade through flooded plains. In these situations, the Viet Cong used ankle-breaker trapped shallow pits dug into the riverbed, lined with angled stakes and concealed with silt. A soldier stepping into one could have his leg twisted or punctured before he even knew the hazard was there. In deeper crossings, weighted nets were sometimes employed, designed to entangle and pull down those who walked into them. Panic was the real weapon here. Once one man began to struggle, others would rush to help, risking entrapping themselves. The psychological toll of these water traps was immense. Soldiers had to move slowly, probing ahead with poles, scanning the water for disturbances, and listening for the faintest splash or thud that might indicate danger. In the oppressive humidity, this caution was exhausting, and fatigue bred mistakes. Even the most disciplined units found their pace slowed to a crawl, their nerves frayed by the knowledge that the water hid threats they might never see until it was too late. Of course, the waterways were not just defensive spaces, they were also the lifelines of the Viet Cong. They used them to transport supplies, move fighters, and communicate between distant units, often under the noses of enemy patrols. This dual use meant that the traps had to be carefully marked or remembered to avoid harming friendly forces. In some cases, only certain routes through a river or canal were safe, and these were communicated through subtle markers and arrangement. Of leaves on a branch, a certain knot in a piece of rope tied to a riverside tree, or even the position of a tethered boat, the waterways proved that war in Vietnam was as much about patience and adaptation as it was about firepower. The Viet Cong's traps here relied on understanding the enemy's behavior, the flow of the environment, and the power of uncertainty. They didn't need to stop every boat or drown every soldier. They needed only to make the enemy doubt the safety of the water itself. In doing so, they turned the rivers and canals into battlegrounds, every bit as dangerous as the jungle or the tunnels. In the next part, we will follow the fight back onto dry land, into villages and small settlements, where the Viet Cong's traps were adapted to blend seamlessly with the architecture of daily life, hidden in walls, doorways, and even beneath the floors of homes, making every step within a seemingly peaceful hamlet as dangerous as walking through the most hostile terrain. Villages in wartime. Vietnam could be both sanctuary and snare, depending entirely on the unseen. Choices made by the people who lived there, or by those who had passed through, under the cover of darkness. To the weary soldier approaching from a long march, the sight of a cluster of thatched roofs and the sound of distant chatter might offer comfort. Chickens pecking at the dust, children playing barefoot near a well, smoke curling lazily from cooking fires. These were the signs of normal life, a rhythm that suggested safety. But in the Vietnam War, appearances were among the most carefully cultivated weapons. The Viet Cong understood that the human mind longs for places that seem predictable and calm, and they learned to twist that longing into a deadly vulnerability. The hamlet might look untouched, but the ground beneath its paths could be seeded with mines. The walls of its houses might conceal hidden firing slits. The very door a soldier pushed open for shelter could be rigged to kill him. One of the simplest, yet most effective village traps was the doorway booby trap. In homes or public buildings, the Viet Cong would rig grenades or explosive charges to door frames using tripwires or tension release systems. A door left slightly ajar was an invitation. A soldier pushing it open with casual force might trigger the mechanism instantly. Sometimes these traps were more psychological and lethal, releasing smoke or causing a loud detonation without significant damage, but their purpose was the same: to make every entry feel like a gamble. In areas where patrols passed frequently, doors could be trapped one day, left safe the next, then trapped again after weeks of being untouched, creating an atmosphere where routine was impossible. Floors, too, could be deadly. In some homes, a section of the packed earth floor was dug out and replaced with a spike pit covered by a thin layer of woven reed matting, dusted with dirt to blend perfectly with the surroundings. A heavy piece of furniture, perhaps a table or storage chest, might be placed atop the trap, with one leg resting on the concealed cover. Move the furniture to search beneath it, and the weight shift would cause the matting to collapse, sending the unlucky intruder down onto the sharpened stakes. In other cases, floorboards were altered so that they would give way under the weight of someone stepping in the wrong place, dropping them into a narrow cavity lined with metal shards or bamboo. Points. Walls became hiding places for both traps and weapons. False panels, built to look like part of the original construction, could be slid aside from inside the room to reveal a hidden firing position. In more elaborate setups, the panel concealed an explosive charge set to detonate when tampered with. Even seemingly harmless fixtures like hanging baskets, oil lamps, or laundry lines could be adapted into trap triggers. A rope that looked like it was supporting a drying cloth might, when pulled, release a weighted beam from above, or activate a grenade hidden under a pile of straw. The wells that were central to village life were also exploited. Some were booby-trapped, with explosives at their base, triggered by the act of lowering a bucket. Others were seeded with contaminants, poisons, dead animals, or substances designed to make the water undrinkable. These acts had a dual effect. They harmed the enemy directly while also undermining morale, as soldiers realized that even something as vital as drinking water could be turned against them. In open communal spaces like courtyards, the Viet Cong used deceptive landscaping. A patch of ground that looked like it had been recently swept clean might hide a pressure mine beneath a thin crust of earth. A decorative pile of rocks or firewood could conceal the top of a tripwire post. Even livestock pens could be adapted into trap sites with fences wired to explosives or gates rigged to collapse inward, revealing concealed pits just inside the enclosure. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of village traps was the uncertainty about who had placed them. In some cases, local villagers actively worked with the Viet Cong, setting the devices themselves. In others, they had no choice, coerced into cooperation under threat of violence. And sometimes, the traps were installed by guerrillas passing through, leaving the residents as unaware and endangered as the soldiers entering the village. This ambiguity complicated the already tense relationships between armed forces and civilians. A smile from an old woman could mean genuine welcome or quiet satisfaction at knowing the path behind you was seeded with danger. The Viet Cong also exploited the natural flow of occupation and withdrawal. A village liberated by one side might be fortified with traps before the fighters moved on, ensuring that any returning enemy patrol would face a gauntlet of surprises. Because the traps could be hidden in such ordinary places, a doorway, a cooking pot, a child's toy, there was no safe way to relax. Even rest itself became a risk. For soldiers, the psychological strain of village operations was unique. In the jungle or along a river, danger was expected. In a village, the brain wanted to accept the illusion of peace. That moment of lowered guard was what the traps were designed to exploit. Men found themselves stepping over thresholds sideways, probing floors with bayonets, or refusing to touch anything without inspecting it first. Meals could not be eaten without suspicion. Sleep could not be trusted without someone keeping watch. The genius of these village traps lay in their ability to blend with life, making the boundaries between civilian space and battlefield vanish entirely. They turned the most familiar human environments into uncertain ground, where a smile, a doorway, or a drink of water might be the last thing a soldier ever encountered. In the next part, we will leave the quiet lanes and humble huts behind to explore the grander scale of strategic trap networks, large scale systems of interlinked devices and diversions that could control entire battle zones, turning miles of territory into a labyrinth of hidden dangers where even the best trained armies could be slowed, confused, and drained of will. Beyond the intimate dangers of a single doorway or a hidden pit, the Viet Cong's ingenuity reached its most formidable form in large-scale trap networks, vast, interconnected systems designed not just to injure, but to control entire swaths of territory. These were not haphazardly placed devices scattered across the countryside. They were orchestrated patterns of danger, each element carefully positioned to work with the others, creating zones where every step, every vehicle track, and every movement could be predicted, influenced, and exploited. In these areas, the land itself seemed to breathe hostility. The soil, the vegetation, the very air carried the invisible weight of threat. And soldiers knew that once they entered, they were playing by rules the enemy had written long before their arrival. A trap network began with the terrain. The Viet Cong mapped it with obsessive precision, noting every rise and hollow, every water source, every path the enemy might take. They understood how foreign troops moved, the routes they favored, the cover they sought, the places where they might pause to rest. Then they wove traps into these natural tendencies. A well-trodden trail through tall grass might have punji stake pits staggered along its length, each concealed so subtly that even a careful probe might miss one. A clearing that seemed ideal for a helicopter landing zone could be seeded with mines whose pressure plates were buried deep enough to avoid detection by a quick sweep, but shallow enough to detonate under the weight of a troop-laden craft. These traps were rarely placed alone. One device was often positioned to drive the enemy directly into the path of another. A triggered explosion might send a patrol diving for cover straight into a camouflaged pit. A seemingly minor obstacle, like a blocked trail, could force a detour through terrain thick with concealed wires. The goal was not only to harm, but to steer movement, to turn the enemy into pieces moving along a board where every square could be deadly dot in some regions, especially near the Siu Chi tunnels. Trap networks were paired with underground systems. A surface-level tripwire might be connected not to a nearby explosive, but to an alert line inside the tunnels, warning hidden fighters of the approaching enemy. This gave the Viet Cong precious seconds or minutes to prepare an ambush or retreat. Some tunnels even had vertical shafts leading up into disguised trap sites, allowing fighters to reset devices, retrieve valuable parts, or slip away entirely after luring troops toward danger. One particularly sophisticated method involved layered traps, multiple devices stacked in sequence along a single approach. For example, an initial mine might be buried deep enough to damage a tank's treads without destroying it entirely, forcing the crew to dismount. As they work to repair the vehicle, they might trigger secondary traps hidden in nearby cover, such as grenades tied to foliage or weighted logs rigged to swing down from above. By escalating the danger in stages, these networks prolong the enemy's exposure, wearing down both manpower and morale. Natural barriers were seamlessly incorporated into these systems. Rivers were paired with choke points where floating mines were most effective, while adjacent riverbanks might be mined to prevent safe disembarkation. Dense jungle patches could hide entire grids of tripwires, each one connected to a different device, some explosive, some non-lethal but disorienting, like noisemakers or smoke charges designed to confuse and scatter formations. The combination of real and dummy traps was particularly effective, as it trained soldiers to react with the same caution to harmless triggers as they would to deadly ones, further slowing their progress. Psychological manipulation was central to the success of large-scale trap zones. Patrols often entered these areas already on edge, having heard stories of comrades lost in seemingly calm stretches of countryside. The Viet Cong exploited this tension by designing traps that were as much about fear as function. A small blast might be timed to go off far enough from a patrol to cause no harm, yet close enough to rattle nerves. In the tense silence that followed, every rustle of leaves or creak of bamboo could sound like the prelude to another detonation. Resupply routes were particular targets. Convoys, whether on foot, by truck, or by boat, moved on schedules dictated by necessity, and the Viet Cong mapped these with care. In one infamous example, a narrow jungle road was lined with alternating rows of buried mines and concealed spike pits, positioned so that if one device went off, the survivor's instinctive move to the side would land them directly into another hazard. Clearing such a route could take hours, during which the convoy was vulnerable to sniper fire, ambush, or even further mining behind them. Trapping them in place. The genius of these networks was their adaptability. A trap zone could be rearranged in a matter of days, with devices relocated, triggers altered, and paths re-camouflaged to keep even the most experienced units guessing. This fluidity meant that intelligence gathered on a safe path one week might be useless or deadly the next. In some areas, the Viet Cong intentionally left sections untrapped for weeks at a time, allowing the enemy to grow complacent before reseeding the ground and catching them off guard. For those tasked with crossing these zones, the work was slow, exhausting, and mentally corrosive. Every footstep had to be placed with care, every branch inspected before being moved aside. Metal detectors and probing tools offered some reassurance, but they were not foolproof, especially against non-metallic triggers made of bamboo or wood. Even the most disciplined soldiers could not maintain perfect caution indefinitely. Fatigue bred mistakes, and mistakes in a trap network were often fatal. These zones were more than just physical barriers. They were strategic statements. They declared ownership of the land in a way that outposts or flags could not. They told the enemy, "You may pass here only at the cost of blood, time, and willpower." In this way, the Viet Cong could deny the enemy control over territory without needing to match them in open battle, a crucial advantage in a war where mobility, endurance, and psychological dominance mattered as much as firepower. In the next part, we will descend into the most intimate layer of this hidden war, the personal traps designed not for wide areas or coordinated defenses, but for targeted elimination devices crafted for assassinations, sabotage, and sudden, decisive strikes that could turn the tide of a single encounter or send ripples through an entire campaign. While large-scale trap networks were the silent skeleton of the Viet Cong's battlefield control, there existed another, far more personal dimension of their craft traps and devices designed with individual targets in mind. These were not meant to defend swaths of territory or exhaust entire battalions, but to remove a single person, sabotage a single mission, or send a pointed and unforgettable message. In this shadowy layer of the war, the enemy could never be certain whether the object in his hand, the chair he sat upon, or even the meal he was about to eat might hold the final act of his life. Unlike the sprawling trap grids that soldiers could brace themselves for, these personal devices were intimate in their design, tailored to moments of supposed safety, when a person's guard was at its lowest. One of the most unnerving categories of these was the targeted gift. The Viet Cong sometimes used objects meant to appear like useful or desirable items, watches, radios, or weapons planted where enemy forces were likely to find them. These objects were often booby-trapped with pressure detonators, so that the act of picking them up, twisting a dial, or opening a latch would trigger an explosion. In some cases, these devices were planted in locations known to be searched for loot after a skirmish, turning the natural temptation to claim spoils into a lethal mistake. Equally chilling were the assassinations carried out through personal effects. Officers and informants living among civilians were sometimes targeted through traps hidden in their possessions. A bicycle's brake lever could be rigged with a small explosive charge, detonating when squeezed. A pair of boots left unattended might conceal sharpened spikes inside the soles, angled to pierce the foot with every step. In rare but effective cases, even the bedding of a target could be altered sections of a hammock cut to give way after a delay, dropping the sleeper onto a concealed spike pit below. Food and drink were not exempt. The Viet Cong understood that soldiers trusted meals provided by known contacts, especially in supposedly secure areas. They sometimes exploited this by contaminating rations or drink containers. While poisoning could be effective, it often lacked a psychological shock of a sudden trap, so they occasionally blended methods, placing a small timed charge in the base of a cooking lot, for example, so it would detonate just as food was being served. The suddenness of such events sent waves of paranoia through units, making it harder for soldiers to trust even their most basic needs. Vehicles were common targets for personalized sabotage. Motorbikes used by messengers could have their fuel. Tanks rigged with incendiaries set to ignite after a certain distance, ensuring the rider would be far from help when the fire broke out. Trucks carrying high-value supplies might have mines placed along their expected parking spots, triggered by the pressure of the vehicle's weight. In one infamous incident, an officer's jeep was destroyed not by a roadside bomb, but by a grenade wired into the driver's seat springs, detonating the moment the seat compressed under his weight. These personalized traps were not only about eliminating targets, they were also about shaping behavior. When word spread that officers had been killed by sabotaged chairs or radios, others became wary of using such items. The constant second-guessing slowed routines, eroded efficiency, and introduced hesitation at moments when decisiveness was critical. This was especially valuable to the Viet Cong, who thrived on exploiting moments of doubt in urban settings. The Viet Cong adapted these methods to the cramped, unpredictable landscapes of towns and cities. Staircases could be rigged so that the third or fourth step from the top would collapse under weight, dropping the victim onto sharpened debris below. Ceiling fans or light fixtures might be fitted with small charges set to detonate when switched on. In some cases, these urban traps were designed to cause minimal structural damage while still delivering a fatal or incapacitating blow, preserving the cover of the location for future operations. What made these personal traps so effective was the precision with which they were deployed. They required intimate knowledge of the target's habits, what routes they walked, where they liked to sit, and what time they ate or rested. This intelligence often came from local sympathizers or coerced civilians, whose survival depended on providing information. The Viet Cong's ability to blend into the civilian population meant they could gather such details without drawing suspicion, sometimes even from within the target's social circles. The fear these traps inspired often outlasted their actual use. A single well-publicized incident could haunt an enemy unit for weeks or months. Soldiers would find themselves inspecting every object they touched, walking in wide arcs around familiar furniture, and refusing to sit in the same place twice. This level of hypervigilance drained mental reserves, leaving troops more susceptible to mistakes in other areas. In the end, these intimate one-on-one devices were less about the number of casualties they caused, and more about the psychological war they waged. The Viet Cong didn't need to trap every chair or doorway. They only needed to make soldiers believe they might. Once that seed of doubt was planted, every creak of wood, every clink of metal, every unfamiliar object became a potential executioner. In the next and final part, we will explore how this war of traps, whether spread across miles of countryside or hidden in a single teacup, left a legacy that lingered long after the last device was dismantled. We will step into the uneasy peace that followed, where the land and the people who lived upon it carried invisible scars, and where even decades later, the shadow of an unseen danger could still shape how footsteps fell. When the guns fell silent and the last patrols withdrew, the war of traps did not end. The jungle kept its secrets, and the soil tilled, planted, and walked upon for centuries still held the teeth of the conflict. In the years that followed, as peace returned in name, but not entirely in spirit, the legacy of the Viet Cong's traps became a shadow stitched into the very fabric of the land. Farmers plowing their fields would sometimes strike something hard, not a root or stone, but the rusted casing of an old mine. Children playing in the undergrowth stumbled across corroded tripwires, so brittle they snapped at the lightest touch, yet still attached to devices that could maim or kill. The war had left behind a vast invisible map of danger, one that even those who had fought in it could not always read. Clearing these remnants was a monumental task, undertaken slowly and often by hand. Teams of deminers, both Vietnamese and international, combed through villages, rice paddies, and hillsides with metal detectors, prodding rods, and a patience born of necessity. For them, each day's work was a conversation with the ghosts of the past. Some traps had degraded to harmlessness, their bamboo spikes rotted to mush, their charges rendered inert by years of rain and heat. Others were as lethal as the day they were planted, their explosives sealed tight in waxed containers, their triggers preserved by careful craftsmanship. The deminers learned to read the land in reverse, seeking the patterns of placement that the Viet Cong had once studied so obsessively, but removal was never complete. The sheer number of devices, scattered across so many miles, meant that even decades after the war's end, rural families still encountered sudden, shocking reminders of the conflict. A rusted punji frame might be found beneath the collapse of an old footbridge. A hollow in the earth might reveal itself as a covered pit, its contents intact. In certain remote regions, locals simply adapted, learning to avoid particular patches of ground or altering paths that had been followed for generations. The knowledge of danger became another inheritance, passed quietly from parent to child. Psychologically, the traps had a long afterlife as well. For veterans of both sides, the memory of walking into a landscape where the air seemed heavy with hidden intent could never be erased. Many described how, even in peacetime, their senses would flare in certain environments: dense undergrowth, narrow alleys, or the sharp scent of disturbed earth could bring an involuntary tightening of breath. Some carried injuries that spoke of moments when vigilance failed by a fraction of a second. Others bore scars invisible to the eye, the product of years spent waiting for something to explode, spring, or strike. The war of traps also left a cultural mark. In villages near the old Siu-Chi tunnel regions, elders told stories of how the land itself had been an ally, reshaped by human hands to defend their homes. These tales carried a mixture of pride and sorrow, for while the ingenuity of the traps was undeniable, so too was the cost they inflicted on friend and foe alike. In some areas, memorials were erected not just to the fighters who fell, but to the civilians who died when the line between battlefield and home blurred beyond recognition. In modern Vietnam, the remnants of the war had been woven into a new narrative. At certain historical sites, reconstructed examples of punji pits, spiked doors, and concealed grenade setups are displayed for visitors. Guides explain their function in soft, matter-of-fact tones, inviting curiosity while acknowledging the discomfort such ingenuity can provoke. Tourists peer into these recreated dangers with the safety of distance, yet the earth around them may still hide real, forgotten cousins of the display. The contrast between the past as exhibit and the past as unresolved hazard is never far from mind. Internationally, the tactics of the Viet Cong became subjects of military study. Analysts examined how simple materials, bamboo, scrap metal, rope, had been transformed into weapons capable of challenging technologically superior forces. Manuals dissected the psychological elements of the traps, the way they manipulated movement and decision-making. In some cases, these principles were adapted into other conflicts, showing how ideas born in the humid jungles of Vietnam could find echoes in deserts, mountains, and cities far away. The knowledge, once used to defend a specific homeland, became part of a broader, more unsettling legacy of asymmetric warfare. For the Vietnamese people, though, the inheritance was far more personal. The war's traps were not just tools of history, they were, and in some places still are, part of daily life. Farmers checked their fields in early morning light, watching for glints of metal in the soil. Fishermen tread carefully along riverbanks, where minds might have shifted with the current. Children are taught to treat certain objects, however ordinary they seem, with suspicion. This constant, quiet caution is a survival skill passed through generations, a reminder that even peace must sometimes be walked through gently. And yet, there is resilience. Over the years, fields have been reclaimed, roads rebuilt, and villages restored to rhythms older than the war. The jungle, once sliced with hidden dangers, has begun to heal, though the healing is uneven and slow. Bamboo grows over old punji frames. Vines thread through rusted wire, and animals make homes in places that once were deadly. The land does not forget, but it adapts, just as the people have. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Viet Congs. Traps is the way they reshaped the relationship between people and their environment. In war, the land had been an active participant, molded and sharpened into a weapon. In peace, it became something to be coaxed back into neutrality, a process that required patience, skill, and respect. This transformation speaks to the dual nature of ingenuity. The same creativity that can devise 1,000 ways to harm can also find 1,000 ways to heal. So now, if you walk through the jungles of Vietnam, you may find them quiet, the air, heavy only with the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves. You may not see the marks of the war beneath your feet, but the people who live there know they are there, sleeping in the soil. Some traps will never be found, never be triggered, and will simply dissolve into the earth with time. Others will be uncovered by chance, their presence a sharp reminder that history, however deeply buried, has a way of touching the present. Perhaps, as the night settles over such places, you can almost feel the stillness that once carried so much fear. The danger has faded, but the memory remains. A whisper in the dark leaves, a quiet echo of a time when every step was a question with no certain answer. Maybe, as you close your eyes, you can imagine walking through that world, not as a soldier, not as a fighter, but as someone simply trying to move forward, knowing that somewhere underfoot, the past is still waiting. If you've stayed awake through this journey, you've walked a long road with me, from the first crude stakes hidden in the mud to the vast networks that shaped the battlefield, from the intimate traps of assassination to the slow, careful work of peace. Perhaps now your eyes are heavy, your breathing steady. But if you're still here, tell me, what part of this story will you remember when you next step into the quiet? And if you're drifting off, let the thoughts settle gently, that even in a world of hidden dangers there is always a way forward, one careful step at a time.